Chapter 61, The Unknown. As I mentioned earlier, to everyone's surprise, today's Defense Against the Dark Arts practical class was not held in the usual auditorium. After Professor Blaine briefly explained the day's agenda, he led the students to the 8th floor of the castle, stopping in front of an abandoned classroom near Headmaster Dumbledore's office. Atticus Blaine, observing the slightly excited young wizards gathered in the corridor, smiled warmly. I've used a complex spell to expand the space in this classroom slightly, allowing it to accommodate the dark creatures you'll be dealing with today. What exactly are we facing, Professor Blaine? Wayne Hopkins, a second-year Hufflepuff, raised his hand and called out. He glanced at Harry, who was whispering with Hermione and Ron, and speculated, could it be a troll? Sorry, Hopkins, Professor Blaine replied. As I mentioned before, I won't reveal the name of the dark creature in advance. You'll have to see it for yourselves. Now let me explain the rules of this game. Leaning against the oak door with his arms crossed, Atticus continued. Second-year students will pair up, while first-years will form groups of 3. Together, you'll face the creatures inside. Due to time constraints, each group has a 10-minute limit. If you exceed the time or fail, it will count as a loss. The crowd buzzed with nervous energy. Many students picked up on the ominous tone in Professor Blaine's words. Ron and Harry exchanged uneasy glances, both sensing that the creature inside might be more than just interesting. In the crowd, Malfoy began to tremble, suspecting a possibility he didn't want to believe. Death, Neville whispered, his voice quivering as if he might faint. Fortunately, Hermione maintained her composure. She glared at Neville, her voice firm and instructive. Professor Blaine wouldn't let anyone die, Neville. Headmaster Dumbledore and the Ministry of Magic wouldn't allow it. That's not entirely reassuring, Miss Granger, Professor Blaine interjected with a playful expression, his smile sending a chill through many students. The things I've done over the years might surprise you. All I can promise is that I'll do my best to prevent any fatalities during this trial. With a flick of his wand, Atticus conjured a parchment glowing with red magical light, which appeared before him. He surveyed the crowd before allowing the magical contract to float into Hermione's hands. Before anyone enters the classroom, they must sign their name on this magical contract. Miss Granger, please read it aloud for everyone. Hermione eagerly took the parchment, but as she read it, her initial confidence waned, and her cheeks turned pale. Harry, Ron, and Neville, peering over her shoulder, seemed to struggle for breath as if an invisible hand gripped their throats. Hermione looked at Professor Blaine, hoping it was an April Fool's joke, but the sincerity in his eyes confirmed otherwise. With many anxious students urging her on, Hermione began her duty. 1. Participants entering the classroom for the trial, whether successful or not, must not disclose anything they see inside by any means. Those who have not participated are forbidden from inquiring. 2. Each group member has 2 attempts in this trial. If the first attempt fails, until the end of the... Her voice trailed off as the weight of the contract's implications settled over the group. In the second round of the trial, no one is permitted to seek advice or consult any information. Participants are only allowed to discuss strategies with their group members to pass the trial. Atticus Blaine interrupted Hermione with a smile, addressing everyone. The purpose of these 2 rules is to ensure that you rely on your own wisdom and the collective intelligence of your companions to defeat the dark creatures within under completely unknown circumstances. The most crucial rule is the 3rd one. Miss Granger, please continue. Hermione swallowed hard and read the final rule in a strained voice. 3. Participation in this trial is not mandatory, but those who choose to participate must sign the contract. Signing your name indicates full awareness of the dangers involved. Any casualties are not the responsibility of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry or Professor Atticus Blaine of Defense Against the Dark Arts. A murmur of shock rippled through the 70 or 80 young wizards gathered in the corridor. Amidst the chaos, Hermione struggled to voice her concern. This is against the law, Professor. The Ministry of Magic won't approve such an exemption. Atticus shrugged nonchalantly. Let the Ministry of Magic be damned, Miss Granger. As I've mentioned, sometimes I enjoy defying the rules. But Headmaster Dumbledore won't allow it either, cried Sophie Roper from Ravenclaw. "Then let Headmaster Dumbledore come and see for himself." "Ahem," Atticus paused, adopting a more amicable demeanor. "In fact, Miss Roper, Headmaster Dumbledore has already approved my teaching plan. Of course, if you don't feel brave enough to face the fear of the unknown, you can choose not to participate. As I said, this is not mandatory." "Is this possible, Harry?" Ron murmured, as shocked as everyone else. "How could Headmaster Dumbledore—" "I can't answer that, Ron. I only know one thing." Harry's heart pounded in his chest, his face flushed with a mix of fear and excitement at the prospect of facing unknown challenges. All in all, it wasn't a bad feeling. Professor Blaine might be serious. We should take this seriously. Hermione continued to scrutinize the parchment with wide eyes, searching for any loopholes. Her trembling fingers revealed that Atticus's elaborate setup had been quite effective. "You have only 2 minutes to decide," Atticus announced, deliberately turning away and taking a few steps forward, giving the bewildered young wizard space to discuss. The students from Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin reacted differently. Despite sharing the same fear, most Gryffindors, who prided themselves on their courage, were eager to take on the challenge. Hermione was already muttering potential spells under her breath, while Neville's round eyes were wide with anxiety, hoping for guidance that no one could provide. The Ravenclaw students remained calmer than those from the other houses, analyzing whether Professor Blaine's contract was merely a bluff with no real binding effect. Hufflepuff wizards were on the lookout, their decisions likely influenced by the choices of the other houses. Some young Slytherins, known for their self-preservation instincts, were already discreetly blending into the crowd. However, Malfoy seemed to have made up his mind. With dry lips, he glanced between Crabbe and Goyle, his usually confident demeanor appearing somewhat shaky. Suddenly, an idea struck him, and he raised his hand to ask a question. "Professor Blaine, if I decide to participate, will I be able to choose my teammates?" Draco Malfoy asked loudly, catching the attention of Harry and Ron, who paused in surprise. It was a rare moment when Malfoy posed a genuinely insightful question. "Unfortunately, Mr. Malfoy," Atticus Blaine replied after a brief pause, a smile playing on his lips. "To foster interaction between the different houses and to enhance mutual understanding among young wizards, I will be selecting your team members myself." Harry shifted uneasily, his mind flashing back to the time Professor Snape had paired him with an unexpected partner in Professor Lockhart's dueling class. The memory was still vivid and unsettling. "So," Professor Blaine continued, his voice the only sound echoing through the silent corridor. He surveyed the young wizards, each lost in their own thoughts, and spread his arms wide in a welcoming gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to make your decision." End of this chapter. Chapter 62, Entering the Urn. The final results were in. Among the 2 grades of nearly 100 young wizards, almost half chose to withdraw. Hufflepuff and Slytherin had the highest number of dropouts, followed by Ravenclaw, with Gryffindor having the fewest. This outcome was not unexpected. Atticus Blaine quickly organized the remaining young wizards into teams, meticulously counting them. There were 10 groups for the first graders and slightly more for the second graders, totaling 21 groups. Harry and Draco stood together, their expressions dark as they exchanged looks of disdain. "If you're willing to kneel and beg now, Potter," Malfoy sneered, his lips curling, "when some monster stuffs you in its mouth, I might be merciful enough to gather your remains and return them to your foolish friends. At least they'll have something to remember you by." Harry met Malfoy's gray eyes without flinching. "Surprises me, Malfoy," he retorted. "I thought you couldn't even walk without your 2 big bodyguards." At that moment, Atticus, who had been busy organizing the groups, returned to the classroom door. "Time is precious, everyone. Is there anyone who volunteers to take the lead?" he asked. Silence filled the room as the young wizards, their courage spent, stared at their toes, avoiding Professor Blaine's gaze. Disappointed by the lack of response, Atticus glanced around before his eyes landed on Harry and Malfoy, who were still locked in their silent battle. With a smile, he announced, "Then, let Mr. Potter and Mr. Malfoy demonstrate their dazzling courage and wisdom." As the reality of the situation set in, Harry regretted his impulsive decision to sign the contract. He turned to see Ron, Hermione, and Neville at the back of the queue, their faces filled with concern. For their sake, he forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the doorknob. "Is this it?" Malfoy, his earlier bravado gone, looked at Atticus almost pleadingly, hoping for some guidance. But Atticus ignored Malfoy's silent plea, instead raising his voice slightly to address Harry, who was turning the handle. "Most dark creatures dislike light, Potter. It might be a bit dark in there, so be careful not to trip." Encouraged by Hermione and Ron's voices from outside, and with Malfoy hesitating behind him, Harry wasn't even sure if he was still in the castle. He stared at the room before him, trying to recall every spell he had learned or heard of, wondering which one could transform an ordinary classroom into a Quidditch pitch-sized circular maze. As Malfoy closed the door, the light and sound from outside were abruptly cut off, plunging the room into a dim, twilight-like obscurity. The air was thick with cold smoke and the stench of rotting meat, reminiscent of Nick's death day party. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the faint drip of water onto the brown slate floor. In this eerie setting, Harry's vision was severely limited. He dared not move forward recklessly, instead pointing his wand ahead, trying to see more. Fear and the unknown momentarily dissolved Malfoy's animosity towards Harry. Unconsciously, he edged closer to Harry, his voice trembling as he spoke. Draco was no longer as arrogant as usual. "What do you think lies ahead for us, Potter?" he asked. "I know as much as you do, Malfoy," Harry replied, his tone less aggressive than before. His eyes remained steady, trying to pierce through the thin fog that enveloped the air in front of them. "Come here, Draco." A familiar, gloomy voice emerged from behind the fog. Its presence immediately revitalized Malfoy and caused Harry's uneasy heart to sink. "And you, Potter, do you plan to dawdle through these 10 minutes? Unfortunately, unless I announce the beginning and end, you'll remain in this room indefinitely." Snape's voice dripped with disdain, but Harry was accustomed to it. In this strange environment, filled with hidden dangers, Snape's disdain almost felt comforting. "Professor, are you here to guide me on how to defeat the Dark Kree, Achures behind the wall?" Malfoy eagerly approached the maze's entrance, looking at the professor who cared for him most at school. "Can you tell me what's locked inside, and what tricks I can use to deal with it?" "You must rely on yourself, Draco. Professor Blaine also had me sign a magical contract, preventing me from disclosing any information." Snape's face darkened as he recalled being compelled to sign the contract by the amiable Atticus Blaine. His next words wiped the joy from Malfoy's face entirely. "Headmaster Dumbledore and Professor Blaine placed me here to minimize casualties in this dangerous project." Snape glanced at Harry, who stood uneasily a few feet away, eyeing the maze's entrance. A wicked smile curled at the corner of Snape's mouth as he spoke in his usual classroom tone. "But you know, Draco, if danger strikes suddenly, I might not have time to pull you both from the monster's jaws." Harry understood that Snape's words were directed at him. If he and Malfoy were in danger simultaneously, it was obvious whom Snape would save first. "Professor." Harry feigned ignorance of Snape's implication. He pointed his wand at a puddle of viscous brown liquid slowly dripping onto the ground near the maze's right entrance. "That? Could it be bloodstains?" Malfoy, alerted by Harry's observation, gasped and turned to flee toward the door. But Snape caught him by the shoulder. "Professor Blaine's magic contract is highly restrictive. Once signed, you can't back out. Draco, your father wouldn't be pleased to see you become a squib." From the moment they stepped into this classroom, there was no turning back. Despite their fear, Harry and Draco each chose an entrance under Snape's stern gaze and ventured inside. The labyrinth exuded an ominous, deathly aura, and their desolate, helpless figures quickly vanished into the darkness, ready to consume them. End of this chapter. Chapter 63. Stimulation. Harry walked through a passage about 10 feet wide, with mottled walls on either side, stretching up to the ceiling. It was even darker here than before, and the faint glimmer of light was just enough to make out his fingers. After bumping into the wall while turning, Harry remembered he could use his wand to create some light. The silence was so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat, and in the dark, endless corridor, a cloud of white mist occasionally floated by, resembling the glow emitted by ghosts. This maze felt like a magical relic buried deep underground for thousands of years. Water seeped from the walls, nourishing the large green moss growing in the corners and making the dark brown floor tiles extremely slippery. To avoid falling, Harry turned sideways, moving step by step, looking comically like a crab. The path behind him quickly vanished into darkness, and the road ahead remained uncertain. Pale and anxious, Harry had to admit that this maze, with its tomb-like atmosphere, was the scariest place he had ever encountered. Could it be that Professor Blaine has personally explored this maze? He wondered. The ethereal silence and panic made it difficult to gauge the passage of time. Harry felt as though he had been wandering in this seemingly endless maze for an hour, but in reality, it might have been less than 2 minutes. "At least, I can't lose to Malfoy," Harry muttered, pursing his lips tightly to suppress the constant urge to turn back and continue exploring. The area illuminated by the wand's light was monotonous, but this dull scene invisibly heightened his imagination of terrifying images to the extreme. Harry could hardly imagine how Ron or Hermione would react upon entering this maze, and as for Neville, he feared the boy might faint on the spot. Could it be that in this ghostly place, Professor Blaine deceived everyone, intending only to scare us with this gloomy maze? Harry thought, gritting his teeth as he continued forward. Despite never encountering any living creature, the idea crossed his mind. However, considering Professor Blaine's behavior, he felt the likelihood of such a trick was slim. The surroundings grew even more dismal. With the wand's light, Harry could see that each breath he exhaled formed a mist in the air, as if he were walking into a cold room. Tick, tick. The further he walked, the more humid the air became, and Harry's hair was dampened with countless fine droplets of water. Finally, a different scene appeared ahead. Harry's heart pounded relentlessly. The only things providing him a sense of security were the wand in his hand and the cold, hard wall. "It's just a small river." He sighed with relief upon seeing the ground. In the narrow corridor, a 10-foot-wide water channel lay across the path, completely blocking his way forward. Why had Professor Blaine created a small canal here? In the dim light, Harry stood on the embankment, carefully examining the river, which was covered with dark green algae and had a large rotten log floating in the middle, emitting a foul odor like a stinking ditch. Questions filled his mind. The way back was still shrouded in darkness, and Harry had a premonition that Snape was lurking somewhere unseen, waiting to mock him. If he took a step back, Snape would surely leap out with that sneering face, ready to announce that Harry had lost the courage contest to Malfoy. Gryffindor, a symbol of bravery, losing to someone from Slytherin in a test of courage. Harry couldn't bear the thought. Atticus Blaine would rather be swept away by the river before him than face such a terrible fate. With a determined exhale, Harry resolved that he must not falter here. 10 feet was not a trivial distance to leap, but as the youngest seeker at Hogwarts in a century, Harry, brimming with athletic prowess, found it manageable. His eyes fixed on a piece of rotten wood, slick with algae, in the middle of the ditch. Professor Blaine must have placed this wood here to help us cross, he thought. With this in mind, Harry too, 2 steps back, inhaled deeply, and leaped with all his might. He landed heavily on the log midair and easily cleared the ditch. The air was colder here, perhaps due to the proximity of the current, and an inexplicable sense of danger loomed. Without hesitation, Harry pressed on, not looking back, his figure quickly vanishing into the shadows. Tick, tick. The moisture in the air condensed into droplets upon contact with the icy walls, falling into the canal and disturbing the wood that Harry had used as a stepping stone. The current nudged the wood to the side until it touched the canal's bank. In the boundless darkness, unnoticed by anyone, a hand as pale as marble emerged from the water, gripping the solid ground. The maze's environment was ever-changing. Beyond the winding corridors, there were small rooms with semicircular domes, their purpose unknown. Relying on his initial impression upon entering and his vague memory of the path, Harry deduced he had likely reached the maze's center. This realization brought him some joy, as it suggested he was progressing faster than Malfoy. Ahead lay a straight corridor. Harry raised his wand, casting a fluorescent glow to illuminate the path. Within 30 feet, nothing new appeared, except for a large, damaged hole in the ceiling, its interior shrouded in darkness. Where did Professor Blaine find such a place? Harry mused. He was now convinced that Professor Blaine had likely restored an area he had once visited. Such a complex and intricate maze couldn't be conjured from imagination alone. As he pondered this, Harry envisioned Professor Blaine's youthful, handsome face and the ever-present smile that seemed immune to disturbance. He thought he understood Professor Blaine a little better, yet realized he had never truly seen beneath the professor's enigmatic exterior. Now more accustomed to the darkness and silence, Harry moved with greater ease. He became increasingly certain that Professor Blaine had crafted this eerie maze to test their courage. The ominous words in the corridor and the magical contract were merely to instill a sense of urgency. After all, the heirs of Slytherin had only petrified Filch's cat, Colin, and Justin. Despite the tension from Headmaster Dumbledore down to the professors, if Professor Blaine's warnings were meant to frighten, the consequences could be dire. No one could bear such a burden. With this realization, the oppressive cold around him seemed less menacing. Harry wiped the sweat from his brow, a smile forming at the corner of his lips. "Sly Professor Blaine," Harry muttered under his breath. He hadn't forgotten that Professor Blaine had set a strict 10-minute breakthrough time for each group. If he didn't exit the maze within that time, both he and Malfoy would be deemed failures, regardless of how far they had progressed in their maze exploration. There would be no glory in that. As Harry navigated the labyrinth, a flurry of thoughts raced through his mind. Why hadn't he seen any sign of Malfoy yet? Could Snape be bending the rules, secretly guiding Malfoy through a more convenient path? Knowing Snape, it wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. The thought made Harry's irritation flare up again. He rubbed his sore right shoulder, determined to quicken his pace and escape the maze as soon as possible. Just as Harry was about to move, a sharp, terrifying sound pierced the darkness ahead. The roar sent a chill down his spine, draining the color from his face. End of this chapter. Chapter 64, Infernal Corpse. Boom! The sudden roar echoed through the labyrinth, causing Harry to slip and fall to the ground. He barely noticed the pain in his backside, his horrified gaze fixed on the encroaching darkness. There was no doubt the scream he had just heard belonged to Malfoy, and it sounded alarmingly close. Malfoy was in danger, confirming the presence of dark creatures within the maze. In mere seconds, Harry's clothes were drenched in sweat. Trembling, he rose from the ground, his instincts propelling him to run toward the source of the scream. Yet, after only a few steps, he hesitated, a conflict evident on his pale, bloodless face. The presence of dark creatures validated Professor Blaine's warnings, and the casualties mentioned in the magical contract loomed ominously in his mind. Malfoy was the one student Harry despised most at Hogwarts, and he knew the feeling was mutual. Despite their animosity, Harry couldn't bear the thought of Malfoy dying. The mere thought of death sent a shiver down his spine. An image flashed before his eyes, a cold corpse lying in a dark corridor, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, robes soaked in blood. A monstrous creature with claws and fangs crouched beside Malfoy's body, tearing into the flesh. "Don't get involved, Harry," he whispered to himself, his lips turning white. "Malfoy won't appreciate it, and Snape is watching from outside." Yet the gruesome image remained etched in his mind, refusing to fade. "Damn it, Malfoy, just this once!" After a moment of internal struggle, Harry's compassion overcame his fear and disdain. He turned back and shouted into the darkness, "Where are you, Malfoy? If you can still breathe, shout again!" Harry strained to listen, but no voice answered. Instead, hurried footsteps echoed from the other side of the passage, rapidly approaching. His heart pounded in his chest, threatening to leap from his throat. "Who's there?" Harry called out. His question was soon answered, as Malfoy stumbled out of the shadows. Harry had never seen Malfoy in such disarray. The usual sneer was gone, replaced by a face streaked with tears and snot. Blood stained his hair and forehead, reminiscent of the pool of blood they had seen before entering the maze. His robe was torn, hanging from his shoulders. When Malfoy spotted Harry, his eyes lit up with an unexpected joy. It was a miracle to see Malfoy relieved at his presence. Harry knew this wasn't the time for such thoughts. "What did you encounter?" Harry asked from 20 feet away. Malfoy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fought to control his trembling body, running toward Harry until he collapsed in front of him, clutching Harry's arm tightly. "There's a dead body, Potter," Malfoy gasped, his face ashen. I saw a dead man." His eyes were unfocused, fear having shattered his defenses. "The corpse was above me. I was walking in the maze, wondering if I should turn back when a drop of blood fell from the ceiling. A pair of white eyes. It was chasing me." Malfoy's words were frantic and disjointed, but the terror in his voice was unmistakable. Harry was certain he had encountered something unimaginably terrifying. Malfoy leaned heavily against him as if he might collapse at any moment. "Don't be ridiculous, Malfoy," Harry snapped, though he noticed his own voice was trembling. "Professor Blaine mentioned dark creatures here, but he didn't say anything about a corpse hidden in the maze. Corpses don't just get up and chase you, right?" "You don't know him at all, Potter," Malfoy retorted, his eyes wide with fear as he stared into Harry's bewildered gaze. "You don't know Atticus Blaine at all, Potter. He's a dark wizard. I've seen him be ruthless in private." Malfoy's outburst seemed to drain him of all rationality. He shook off Harry's support and stumbled away in the direction Harry had come from, muttering incoherently about running away and leaving. Harry's breathing quickened, and fear gripped his heart once more. He watched Malfoy disappear from sight, feeling torn and uncertain. Suddenly, a strange dragging sound emerged from the direction Malfoy had fled, as if someone was being pulled along without lifting their feet. Gulping nervously, Harry pointed his glowing wand towards the sound, every cell in his body trembling with fear. Should he stay and confront the dark creature, or should he turn and flee? "Professor Blaine wouldn't expect us to handle monsters far beyond our abilities, would he?" Harry thought, pressing his dry lips together as he tried to reason with himself. He was determined not to be a coward and forced himself to keep his eyes fixed on the source of the noise. He needed to see for himself what was hidden in the maze, rather than relying solely on Malfoy's account. The wait was excruciating, each second stretching out as if enchanted. Harry edged closer to the wall, pressing his back against it as he braced himself for the final moment of fear. Since entering the classroom, he had prepared himself for unprecedented horrors, perhaps even more terrifying than Hagrid's three-headed dog, Fluffy, or Quirrell without his turban. But when the creature emerged from the shadows, Harry felt as though his entire respiratory system had been plunged into icy water. Each breath was painfully cold, and the defenses he had built in his mind crumbled instantly. It was indeed a corpse, just as Malfoy had claimed. A female corpse, clad in tattered, ancient clothing, with sparse, long hair sprouting from a decaying scalp. Her eyes and skin were pallid and withered. Harry recognized it immediately, for he had never seen anyone move with a dagger embedded in their heart. A strange sound escaped Harry's mouth, the clattering of his teeth as they chattered uncontrollably. In that moment, he found himself admiring Malfoy slightly. It was impressive that Malfoy had managed to flee after encountering such a horror. Run. That was the only thought left in Harry's mind. Why was this long-dead body still moving? Where had Professor Blaine found such an abomination? Defeating a corpse that should be resting in death's embrace was not the priority now. The urgent need was to escape. The wind howled past his ears, a testament to Harry's speed as he ran. Yet, even as he sprinted, he felt it wasn't fast enough. Never before had he felt such an overwhelming urge to flee. Harry missed his broomstick dearly. As he emerged from a small, tomb-like room, he was startled by a sudden voice. "There's one over there too, Potter." Draco Malfoy had appeared unexpectedly from around a corner. The words he shouted, though he seemed somewhat dazed, left Harry completely flustered. End of this chapter. Chapter 65, Unexpected Failure. "You're lying, Malfoy." Harry tried to keep his voice steady, but it came out as a near growl. "I just came from there, Malfoy. There's nothing but a canal. You're just trying to scare people." Under normal circumstances, Malfoy would have retaliated with his wand at Harry's confrontational tone. However, this time he seemed unfazed by the offense. Instead, he sobbed in despair. "A corpse in chains crawled out of the water. I saw it." After uttering these words, Malfoy collapsed in front of the small tomb's round arch, as if drained of all his strength. He murmured, almost to himself, "Blaine wants to kill us, Potter. We're all going to die." "Nonsense," Harry retorted through clenched teeth. Mr. Blaine is the investigator sent by the school board and the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Headmaster Dumbledore will know everything that happened here, and Professor Snape is outside. Harry dismissed Malfoy's irrational fears, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there might be some truth to the story. He recalled the piece of wood he had seen floating in the ditch. After a moment's thought, he realized that the corpse in chains Malfoy mentioned might have been that very piece of wood. When he stepped on it, it seemed to awaken from an eternal slumber. Now, Harry found himself in a dire situation. Both the front and back exits were blocked by two animated corpses that looked capable of biting. He and Malfoy were trapped in the middle. In just 30 seconds, they would have to confront these two corpses head-on, and Malfoy, his only teammate, appeared to have given up entirely. "Damn!" Harry muttered as he trotted over to Malfoy, dragging him from outside the arch into the small tomb. Throughout the process, Malfoy offered no resistance, only shaking his head and muttering, "It's over." "No, I have to do something," Harry thought desperately. The rustling sound and the clinking of chains grew louder in his ears. He paced around the small tomb, racking his brain for a viable means of resistance. The best solution would be to find two large stones to block the round arches at the front and back of the tomb. Although the walking corpses appeared menacing, they didn't seem particularly strong. If he could seal the entrances, he and Malfoy might survive. However, Harry was not Professor McGonagall, who could effortlessly transform a beetle into a teapot with a flick of her wand. He lacked the magical prowess for such feats. As Harry pondered, the two infernal corpses showed no mercy, refusing to wait for him to devise a perfect plan. They rounded the corner, one after the other, and came into view. The distance between them and Harry was now a mere 30 feet, all petrificus totalis. In the face of imminent danger, Harry abandoned thought and acted on instinct. Without hesitation, he aimed at the swollen face of the corpse, crisscrossed with thin cracks, clad in a prison uniform, and bound by chains. He cast the spell, hoping for the same effect Hermione had achieved on Neville the previous year, turning him into an immobile statue for hours. Unfortunately, Harry's spell failed. The petrified corpse's slow pace faltered momentarily but was not halted. Expelliarmus! Harry tried again, this time targeting the female walking corpse on the other side. The disarming charm was his last hope. The only useful thing Harry had learned from the dueling course taught by Lockhart was actually from Snape. A brilliant red light shot from the tip of Harry's wand, striking the walking corpse squarely in the chest. The spell was so powerful that it forced the creature back several steps. However, this did not solve the problem, as the female walking corpse regained her balance and approached the small room once more. 2 consecutive failures left Harry feeling desperate. Malfoy, leaning against the wall, closed his eyes as if resigned to his fate, waiting for something to bite his neck. What should we do? Harry thought frantically. Large drops of sweat rolled down his forehead, his violet cheeks flushed, as red as a boiled lobster. He recalled what Professor Blaine had told him in his office the previous night. Power is power, and no extreme emotion can instantly grant the strength to conquer fear. At best, it can only solidify one's determination to pursue power. Think, Malfoy, what else can we do to stop them? Harry shouted, his voice tinged with urgency. In the face of life and death, he couldn't afford to criticize Malfoy for his lackluster performance. He hoped for some insight. "We're doomed, Potter," Malfoy replied, his voice trembling as he stood up against the wall, tears in his eyes. "No spell can defeat the dead." Harry's emerald green eyes, having faced the baptism of fear, now glowed with renewed determination. The two Inferi were only 10 feet away from the front and rear doors. "Listen to me, Malfoy. Don't ask why, because I don't know why I'm doing this myself," Harry said, his breath heavy as he turned his gaze to the Inferi restrained by chains. "I'll use the tripping charm to see if I can bring this one down. If it fails, I'll rush out and knock it aside. While it bites my neck, you can slip past and get Professor Snape before I die." Malfoy froze, staring at Harry with his mouth agape, as if seeing him for the first time. Harry didn't give him a chance to question. He raised his wand, his youthful face exuding a fearless radiance. "Wait, Potter. Why?" "It's over, Draco. And you too, Potter. You can put down your wand." Before Malfoy could finish, a calm voice resonated in the small, narrow room. With the sound of this voice, the two ghostly corpses halted as if receiving a signal, no longer advancing. For the first time, the appearance of Professor Snape filled Harry with relief, so much so that he smiled at Snape, who seemed to emerge from the wall. Snape regarded Harry differently than ever before. His usual cold smile was absent, replaced by a complex expression and a hint of sadness in his dark eyes. "Professor," Harry said, his voice cautious, feeling a twinge of fear at Snape's unexpected demeanor. "Did we fail our challenge?" Snape responded with a nasal tone, retrieving a vial of euphoria potion from his robes and roughly handing it to Harry and Draco, watching as they drank. The potion's effects eased the tension from their bluish faces. With the external pressure gone, a wave of exhaustion swept over them, and they nearly collapsed. Snape quickly supported them, tucking each under his arms. However, as he lifted Harry, Snape nearly slipped. Atticus Blaine grabbed the man by the hand and hurled him to the ground. "Let's go," he commanded. Snape cast a final sideways glance at the two infernal corpses, which had returned to their original positions. They passed through the wall and vanished without a trace. As for the new books I recommend, how do you manage to have between 10,000 to 20,000 books with fan value on your book friend list? End of this chapter. Chapter 66. The Night at the School Hospital. Unprecedented. Professor McGonagall's stern reprimand echoed through the school hospital, drowning out the sobs of the young wizards, Madame Pomfrey's urgent calls, and the efforts of the House Deans to console the students. Principal Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine stood at the entrance, facing the furious Professor McGonagall with expressions of helplessness. In the corridor, many senior students attempted to pass by nonchalantly, eager to glean details about Professor Blaine's defense against the dark arts practical class that afternoon. However, they were quickly deterred by Professor McGonagall's piercing gaze. Since Hogwarts was founded, there has never been such a serious teaching accident. Professor Blaine, your innovative teaching methods may be creative, but they must cease unless you intend to send all the children home in one fell swoop. Dumbledore, seemingly uninterested in McGonagall's interrogation, focused on a panoramic telescope on the ceiling. "You know, Professor McGonagall, we took numerous protective measures to ensure safety. Principal Dumbledore himself cast several powerful restraining spells on the two infernal corpses. No one was supposed to be injured." Atticus defended himself with a wry smile. "I merely wanted to test their courage." "Do you think it's just about injuries, Professor Blaine?" Professor McGonagall's eyes flashed with anger. "Even many adult wizards would be terrified by the sight of a corpse." "That's precisely the issue, Professor McGonagall," Atticus replied, exasperated. "No one is born a warrior. If we want these children to respond quickly and effectively to life-threatening situations, we must train them, build their courage, and test their resolve. Under our comprehensive protection, if they can't handle two infernal corpses that can be subdued with a simple spell, then what is the purpose of Hogwarts teaching? Is it merely to pass two meaningless exams?" "Meaningless exams?" Professor McGonagall's lips tightened as she fixed Atticus with her eagle-like gaze. "Those exams determine their future. Let's set that aside for now. Your intentions may be good, but they are still too young. Perhaps you could wait until—" "Wait until when?" Atticus interjected with a smile. "Until the danger is at their throats, and they must learn to use wisdom and courage to resist." As the debate threatened to escalate into a quarrel, Dumbledore intervened. "Perhaps we should let the children decide for themselves," he suggested. Due to time constraints, only half of the young wizards participated in the trial that afternoon, and none managed to effectively deal with the infernal corpses. Many retreated in tears shortly after entering the maze. Among those who persevered, none succeeded in collaborating as Harry and Draco had. Unfortunately, Hermione fell while crossing a small ditch. As she struggled to climb over an overturned log, she accidentally discovered a pair of eyes shrouded in white. Her scream pierced the air, and she fainted. Daphne Greengrass, her partner, was similarly terrified by the sight of the corpse falling from above. Contrary to everyone's expectations, the most remarkable performers were first-year students, Ginny Weasley and Neville Longbottom. Ginny quickly realized there was something unusual about the piece of wood. Using a small magic spell, she activated it and discovered it was actually a dead body. Instead of fleeing, she bravely suppressed her fear and used the freezing curse to immobilize it. The insidious corpse spun in the water at the canal's bank but couldn't surface. Unfortunately, Ginny didn't know how to destroy the corpse and ultimately failed because she exceeded the time limit. Neville Longbottom, often seen as timid, surprised everyone with his unexpected courage. Like Hermione, he fell into the ditch and, despite his fright, managed to engage with the infernal corpse. Eventually, a pale-faced Snape had to pull him out of the water. Madame Pomfrey then provided everyone with chocolate milk, infused with euphoria, improving the atmosphere in the school hospital. Due to Atticus Blaine's magic contract, no one could discuss what happened in the classroom that afternoon. Professor Lockhart, lying on the innermost bed with Colin and Justin, looked like a squirrel with swollen cheeks. He struggled to lift his head, repeatedly asking, "What happened to the flowers and peanuts?" But Hermione, who was closest to him, paid him no attention. Still shaken, she curled up under the quilt, her body trembling slightly, her tear-filled eyes lost. Harry lay next to her, appearing in good condition but with a pale face. He didn't know how to comfort Hermione and was preoccupied with Malfoy's words from that afternoon. Dark wizard, cruel Professor Blaine. What did Malfoy know? Potter, Malfoy spoke sullenly from the opposite bed, having stared at Harry since entering the school hospital. Any advice, Malfoy? Harry retorted. As the most identifiable opponent in the school, it was impossible for Harry to reconcile with Draco just because of a failed cooperation. He gave Malfoy an angry look, his thoughts elsewhere. Malfoy, feeling insulted, pursed his lips tightly, his cheeks flushing visibly. He glared at Harry hatefully before turning away. However, after a few minutes, he couldn't suppress his curiosity. Staring blankly at Harry's cheek, he asked, "Why did you do that this afternoon?" Harry understood what Malfoy wanted to know, but didn't have an answer. His decision at that life-and-death moment was driven purely by instinct. In hindsight, he found it ridiculous. Why had he chosen to save Malfoy, the one he disliked most among all the young wizards at the school? If you'd like to tell me what you meant by your comments on Professor Blaine, Malfoy, maybe I can explain why I made that foolish decision, Harry offered. Potter! Malfoy's slight unease, born from gratitude, vanished completely. He glared at Harry like a threatened hyena. You expect me to thank you for your little help, eh? In fact, you, like everyone else, accomplished nothing. Aha, thanks, Harry retorted, sitting up with sharp eyes. I've never dared to ask for your thanks. Seriously, Malfoy, do you even understand what that word means? The list of book friends suddenly had one more person, it was a bit inexplicable. End of this chapter. Chapter 67. When Principal Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, and Atticus Blaine entered the school hospital one after the other, nearly half of the young wizards were captivated by the inexplicable rivalry between Harry and Draco. It seemed that forgetting was always easier than remembering, and their innate curiosity for the new and unknown was a defining trait. What? Dumbledore began, glancing at the two boys with a smile. He moved to the center of the crowded hall, his presence commanding attention. The young wizards cleared their throats, sensing the energy in the room. I'm so glad I don't see many dejected, lost faces here. Professor McGonagall coughed in mild disapproval, as Dumbledore's words weren't entirely accurate. Several young wizards still bore expressions of fear, their eyes flickering with unease. Just now, Professor McGonagall, Professor Blaine, and I discussed in detail whether the Defense Against the Dark Arts practical class should continue, Dumbledore continued. Professor McGonagall believes that the dark creatures you currently face pose dangers beyond your capabilities. However, Professor Blaine insists that dangers often come unexpectedly, making it urgent and necessary to develop your ability to handle and resolve such threats. Apart from Madame Pomfrey, who leaned against the wall muttering her disapproval, the room was silent. All eyes were fixed on the three figures in the center, each wearing a different expression. I believe the decision should be yours, Dumbledore said, his gaze gentle as he addressed the young wizards. He spoke slowly, ensuring everyone could hear him clearly. Do you think this approach, which may be considered radical, should continue? Contrary to Professor McGonagall's expectations, the young wizards did not eagerly opt out. They exchanged uncertain glances, but no one was quick to voice a desire to quit. But Headmaster Dumbledore, Ginny eventually raised her hand timidly. She glanced at Professor Blaine, who was smiling and seemed indifferent to the student's choice. Fear flickered in her eyes. "We can't give up, can we? I mean, we all signed that contract, and if we give up halfway, we'll be punished severely." "If that's your concern, Miss Weasley, you needn't worry," Atticus Blaine reassured everyone. "Principal Dumbledore has the authority to help you terminate the contract. If anyone feels unable to face the dark creatures in the maze, you can apply now. Both Principal Dumbledore and I can ensure you won't face any punishment." The atmosphere in the hospital became noticeably livelier. Many students appeared eager, yet no one wanted to be the first to speak up. Professor Blaine, Hermione, who had been quiet, raised her hand. "Do you really think that's something a young wizard can handle?" "It's not difficult, Miss Granger," Atticus replied, nodding with a smile at the young witch he admired. "Fear has momentarily blinded you to the enemy's true nature. As I understand it, you, Mr. Potter, and your friend Mr. Weasley once faced a 12-foot-tall troll in the girls' bathroom. Please." He gestured to Hermione and Harry, who was beside her in bed. "Did you use any particularly powerful spells?" "No, Professor," Harry replied, understanding the subtle support in Dumbledore's earlier words. With the headmaster's trust, Malfoy's baseless accusations against Professor Blaine no longer troubled him. Hearing Professor Blaine's question, Harry answered instinctively, "Ron used the levitation charm, and I." Atticus Blaine employed a few clever tactics to divert its attention. In short, although the situation was tense, it didn't require much effort. Professor McGonagall watched proudly as Harry blew his nose vigorously. She seemed on the verge of saying something, but Dumbledore, who was listening intently, gently stopped her. Atticus nodded in satisfaction. He glanced at Madame Pomfrey, who was administering medicine to Professor Lockhart, then surveyed the eager, bright eyes of the students around him and continued, "Who here thinks that what ye encountered in the maze today was more challenging than facing a troll?" The second-year students vividly remembered the events of the previous Halloween night. Trolls, while not particularly mysterious creatures, were familiar to most of the young wizards, even if only from books. Faced with Professor Blaine's question, those who had encountered the infernal corpse earlier that afternoon frowned. "In my opinion, trolls are more difficult to handle," one student exclaimed. "A rampaging troll could toss me into the air, unlike that thing in the maze." As the students' animated discussions reached his ears, Atticus smiled warmly. "It seems you all understand, right? Despair only comes when you face fear and choose to give up completely." "What a marvelous wise remark," Dumbledore murmured softly, removing his half-moon glasses to wipe his eyes. "But, Professor," Hermione, ever the sensible witch, spoke up. Although she felt encouraged by Professor Blaine's words, she sought a more straightforward answer. "We don't know anything about that creature. We don't know how to deal with it." "Ah, but haven't I already given you the method?" Atticus replied with a playful wink. "And my hint was quite obvious, Miss Granger." Unsurprisingly, the students were puzzled. When had Professor Blaine mentioned this terrifying creature in class? The young wizards exchanged confused glances, while Hermione furrowed her brow, trying to recall every lesson, every word, and even private conversations with Professor Blaine since he became the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. Yet, no matter how hard she thought, inspiration eluded her, like moonlight obscured by thick clouds. Beside her, Harry bit his lip in confusion, though he seemed to be on the verge of understanding something. I hope to continue, Professor McGonagall." 10 minutes later, to everyone's surprise, Neville Longbottom, the usually quiet Gryffindor, was the first to raise his hand and voice his opinion. Atticus regarded the round-faced boy with curiosity. This was the second time Neville had surprised him that day. Truthfully, he hadn't expected any student to dare engage in hand-to-hand combat with the infernal corpse. If nothing else, this Longbottom might become a formidable force in the future. "Mr. Longbottom," Professor McGonagall addressed Neville sternly, "if you're merely trying to please your grandmother, you needn't use this method to prove yourself." Her gaze made Neville shrink into himself. especially with Headmaster Dumbledore present. He could barely muster the courage to respond, muttering something inaudible. Then, the decision-making power will be handed over to you two. Atticus didn't wait for every student to voice their opinion. He cast a meaningful glance at Lockhart, then turned to smile at Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall before leaving the school hospital for his office. There, more pressing matters awaited him. End of this chapter. Chapter 68. Atticus Blaine, having just left the school hospital, made his way down the corridor towards the stairs. To his surprise, he encountered several anxious members of the Weasley family gathered at the corner. They seemed to have noticed Professor Blaine approaching, but made no attempt to avoid him, as if they were waiting for him. "It seems it's almost bedtime, Mr. Weasley," Atticus remarked, addressing Prefect Percy and the twins, along with Ron Weasley, who stood behind him. "Are you planning a family reunion?" "That's right, Professor Blaine," Percy the eldest replied after exchanging glances with his siblings. "Professor McGonagall won't allow us to visit the school hospital, but we're worried about Ginny." Atticus smiled knowingly. "It's natural to be concerned about your family. Rest assured, your little sister is perfectly fine. In fact, none of the young wizards sustained any serious injuries. Madame Pomfrey has assured me that they only need to stay overnight for observation and can be discharged early tomorrow morning." This news brought visible relief to the brothers. Ron, who had been fortunate enough to participate in the second half of the trial earlier that day, blinked hopefully and asked, "Professor Blaine, could we visit Ginny? Harry and Hermione are there too." "Sorry, little one," Atticus replied, moving between them and descending the stairs. "I think it's best to follow the doctor's advice and not disturb their rest. Head back to your dormitory and get some sleep. If I return to my office and find you still here, Gryffindor's chances of winning the House Cup this year might just slip away." "I actually wanted to ask Professor Blaine about the preparations for the senior practice class," Percy lamented, watching the professor's retreating figure. "Don't get your hopes up, Percy," one of the twins chimed in. "Professor Blaine is tight-lipped. We've tried, and he wouldn't say a word." With their common goal dissolved, a subtle tension arose among the Weasley brothers. Ron shot a disdainful look at Percy. "I'm not like you, Ron. The twins interrupted with laughter, teasing. "Prefect, go back to bed, all of you," Percy shouted, his face reddening visibly as he watched the twins and Ron walk away. "If you don't learn to behave in the next few months, I'll write to Mom." "Everything all right?" Atticus asked as he entered his office. Came the reply. As the door creaked open, Atticus caught a glimpse of Professor Snape sitting in a chair, his face buried in his hands, shoulders slightly shaking. By the time the door was fully open, Snape had composed himself and strode out of the office. "Scared to tears by a ghostly apparition, it seems," Atticus mused, approaching the stool in the center of the room. He noticed a few drops of water on the floor that hadn't yet evaporated. Raising an eyebrow, he waited until the traces of tears vanished before slowly lifting his head and letting out a curious laugh. Perhaps, before leaving Hogwarts, he should find an opportunity to speak with Professor Snape. With a flick of his wand, the curtains and veils closed instantly. To ensure his privacy from any prying eyes, Atticus continued to weave powerful protective spells in mid-air. The shimmering enchantments etched themselves into the void, shielding his office from Hogwarts across multiple dimensions of magic and space. At this moment, this space was entirely his own. The office was like a floating island in a boundless sea, known only to Atticus Blaine, who resided within it. After extensive research and leveraging his profound magical expertise, Atticus finally mastered the memory magic he had acquired from Lockhart. He now felt confident enough to explore memories without relying on the legendary alchemical artifact, the Pensieve. This newfound ability allowed him to uncover hidden secrets within memories without reintroducing them into his mind. The light from the fireplace and candlesticks was extinguished, and Atticus's magic blocked the moonlight and starlight from entering the room. The office was plunged into darkness, akin to the abyss of the universe. In this eternal darkness, a sliver of silver light pierced the void, like ink dripping into a clear pool. Rhythmic ripples spread and undulated like gentle breaths. Gradually, a beautiful galaxy materialized before Atticus. Could it be a plot that I can't remember? Atticus had been waiting for this mystery to unravel for some time. After a moment of being dazzled, he regained his composure. Enveloped in a magical fluorescent glow, he did not hesitate. Atticus plunged into the soothing, flowing silver mist. He moved like a fish swimming through the river of time, treading lightly through forgotten memories. The images that truly existed were vividly etched in his mysterious eyes, and his mind raced at full speed, his emotions rising and falling in tandem. Do you think we can really make it? The school hospital was dimly lit, with all the young wizards quietly resting in their beds. There was only one reason for their compliance: to ensure no accidents occurred in the hospital, where so many junior wizards were gathered that night. Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout were personally present, overseeing the young wizards alongside Madame Pomfrey. This was a new experience for the two professors, who were now huddled in the small office, chatting animatedly with Madame Pomfrey under the slightly tipsy moonlight. However, the young wizards were not so easily subdued. Although Professor McGonagall had ordered them to sleep well, they secretly exchanged messages. Harry's partner wasn't Hermione. She lay on the opposite bed, staring at him sullenly. He could only discuss non-taboo topics with Hermione. "I don't think Professor Blaine will deceive us," Hermione's note read, delivered by a cautious flying crane that slipped under Harry's quilt. "However, I've recalled every class taught by Professor Blaine, and I can't remember him ever mentioning anything about the maze." Frustrated, Harry crumpled the note, rolled over, and closed his eyes. That night, when Professor Blaine mentioned he had given a hint, Harry felt a flash of insight, as if the truth was just within reach. Yet it was daunting to be so close and unable to break through. Seeing that Harry was no longer interested in continuing the conversation, Hermione's eyes gradually clouded, and her thoughts became less clear. She tucked herself into her quilt, trying to rest, but after tossing and turning for a long time, sleep eluded her. The quiet ward became a symphony of snores in various styles. Hermione left only her forehead exposed to the cool air, entrusting her body to the warmth of the quilt. What did Professor Blaine do before he came to Hogwarts? She wondered. At the first night meeting, Professor Blaine had explained that the dark creature in the maze was something he had encountered during his travels, and because it was of little significance, for the sake of research value, he decided to keep a few of them. What kind of journey awaited him with such a dangerous creature? How would he manage to deal with it? These were questions that might never find answers. As Hermione's eyelids gradually drooped, she soon drifted into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, on the other side, Atticus Blaine waved away the silver mist and returned to the chair behind his desk, falling into a long, contemplative silence. End of this chapter. Chapter 69. Persistence and Letting Go. The protective enchantments surrounding the office had been completely dismantled by Atticus Blaine, allowing the faint starlight to once again illuminate the darkened floor through the gently swaying curtains. Atticus reclined in his chair, his gaze fixed on the mottled patterns of light and shadow, unable to conceal the weariness etched on his face. Before delving into the memory, Atticus had anticipated uncovering some intriguing information. However, despite his vivid imagination, he hadn't expected to find such astonishing revelations hidden within his erased memories. "Harry Potter," he murmured after a prolonged silence, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The memory beneath the dormitory floor was unrelated to the plot he had envisioned, yet it held greater significance, potentially influencing the future direction of events. "No wonder I took such extensive precautions back then," Atticus mused softly. The wry smile had transformed into a more sinister one, his eyes reflecting both relief and lingering doubt. "Am I still entangled in this? But why must it come to this point? Is it truly possible?" The content of the memory clarified why it had surfaced and why it only emerged upon his return to Hogwarts and his encounter with Harry Potter. Yet its existence also deepened Atticus's doubts. These questions could not be answered immediately. Only by traversing the long river of time, step by step, would the mystery eventually be unveiled. The butterfly effect. "It seems my presence has indeed complicated matters," he pondered, twirling his wand between his fingers. His gaze drifted to the voodoo doll on the bookshelf, its nose nearly broken, its body crafted from dragon blood and pale pink. It wouldn't withstand the ravages for long, signaling that his time at Hogwarts was nearing its end. "It's about time for the heat," Atticus remarked, his nostrils flaring as he let out an inexplicable laugh. He could already sense the scent of freedom. Eight-eyed spiders. These are highly aggressive dark creatures that live in colonies. So far, no creature has been found that they don't find palatable, including humans, Atticus explained, addressing the young wizards who had legally ventured to the edge of the forbidden forest. His words tempered their excitement, redirecting their attention to the juvenile eight-eyed spider behind Professor Blaine, its movements akin to a runaway horse. "You can tell from its size that this is a magical creature with remarkable speed and strength. It's crucial to note that the venom of an adult eight-eyed spider can incapacitate even a fire dragon," Atticus continued, speaking confidently to the group of young wizards. "However, dealing with them isn't overly difficult, as their weaknesses are as pronounced as their strengths. Unlike the fur or scales of ordinary magical creatures, the eight-eyed spider's resistance to magic is similar to that of wizards. This means that even a first-year wizard, if they can land a spell on the spider, can defeat it." Professor Blaine, Katie Bell from Gryffindor, raised her hand, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. "If we're bitten by an eight-eyed spider, will it lay eggs in our bodies?" "Why can't you ask a less disgusting question, Katie?" Arya interjected, clearly displeased. Atticus chuckled, waving his hand to lift the petrification spell. He addressed the eager young wizards. "Stand back 300 feet and line up. Try to petrify or stun the eight-eyed spider before it charges at you." The eight-eyed spider injects its venom into you. A friendly reminder, everyone. At this distance, the spider will reach you in less than 5 seconds. This means you only have time to cast 2 spells. Are you really willing to put all your eggs in one basket? Understand that if you fail, you'll have to face the consequences alone, as I will not intervene. You should be grateful to the first and second-year students. I've reduced the difficulty of this practical class to a level that even Phil Chush could handle. Facing a group of eager young wizards, the eight-eyed spider, held aloft by its black limbs, closed its eyes in desperation, as if it had foreseen its own tragic fate. This scene unfolded during the Defense Against the Dark Arts practical class for 3rd, 4th, and 5th-year students. Under strong opposition from Professor McGonagall, Atticus Blaine had to abandon his original plan to recreate the Forbidden Forest environment in a closed classroom, where students would face the eight-eyed spider one-on-one in an entirely unfamiliar setting. However, this level of difficulty seemed just right for the young wizards, and most of them enjoyed the challenge. Some brave and skilled students, like the Weasley twins and Hufflepuff Cedric, could even handle the unfortunate spider with ease. That night in the Gryffindor common room, Fred and George were boasting about how they had immobilized 2 of the spider's slender limbs with the petrification and blasting spells. Ron, who was anxious about the next day's practical class, suddenly looked relieved, as if he had narrowly escaped disaster. "Anything is better than dealing with spiders," Ron said, trembling. His words made Harry and Hermione exchange knowing glances. They understood that Ron's confidence would only last until the next Defense Against the Dark Arts class, where Professor Blaine would teach him the true meaning of sinister. "Say," Ron mumbled through a mouthful of pumpkin pie, frowning at Harry and Hermione, who had been distracted for the past 2 days. "Haven't you two come up with any ideas yet?" Hearing this, Harry slumped back on the sofa, and Hermione set aside her transfiguration paper with a sigh. "It's harder than you think, Ron. I believe you need to be fully prepared." Although Professor Blaine's words at the school hospital were encouraging, it's not easy for us, who lack practical experience, right? Hermione said, looking at Ron, who seemed resigned to his fate. "It's not something you can solve by knocking someone out with a levitation charm." Since Professor Blaine had offered everyone another chance to opt out at the school hospital that night, most of the young wizards who had encountered the Nether Corpse chose to withdraw. However, some were determined to enter the maze again and made new choices. Ron, too, considered giving up, but seeing Harry and Hermione persist, and even Neville spending all day by the fireplace, Pondering which simple spell he could use to defeat the dark creatures in the maze, Ron felt compelled to continue, if only to preserve his fragile self-esteem. After tomorrow, Professor Blaine has scheduled the next practical class for next Thursday. I hope I can come up with a solution by then, Hermione said, her face clouded with worry. Since Professor Blaine has allowed us to give up, why can't we be permitted to look up some information? End of this chapter. Chapter 70, The Secret of the Eyes. In mid-March, with a full week remaining before the Easter holiday, Professor McGonagall informed the second-year students that they would soon need to choose their electives for the third year. This announcement temporarily distracted Hermione from her focus on the Defense Against the Dark Arts practical class. She spent the entire weekend poring over the new class list, unwilling to forgo any of the options. Even during her regular weekend activity of helping Professor Lockhart with his correspondence, she brought the new timetable along, hoping to get some advice from Professor Blaine. "Interest is the best teacher, Granger," Atticus Blaine said with a smile. "Human energy is limited, and you have to make trade-offs. If you're asking for my advice, I think the care of magical creatures and ancient runes might be more practical." "She's decided to sign up for all the subjects," Harry said cautiously. This time, Professor Blaine had not asked anyone other than Hermione to assist Lockhart with his letters, but Harry had accompanied her to Blaine's office, hoping to find clues on how to deal with the Nether Corpse. "Learn everything?" Atticus looked at the determined young witch, her brown eyes shining with resolve. He sighed. "Time might be an issue, Granger. Many classes overlap, and you can't be in two places at once." "That's not a problem, Professor Blaine." "Professor McGonagall gave me a good suggestion," Hermione replied, her quill moving swiftly across the paper. It seemed Professor Blaine's words hadn't swayed her determination. "And what about you, Potter?" Atticus asked, turning his attention to Harry. "Divination and care of magical creatures, Professor. Ron and I have both chosen these courses," Harry replied quickly, his mind still on how to steer the conversation towards the tips Professor Blaine had given in the school hospital. Atticus nodded, though he seemed skeptical. He muttered under his breath, "I heard Professor Kettleburn of the Care of Magical Creatures class might retire in the second half of the year. It seems Headmaster Dumbledore will have a headache finding 2 professors to fill the vacancies." Harry's mouth fell open in surprise, and even Hermione paused her writing to look up at Professor Blaine. After exchanging a glance with Harry, Hermione asked wistfully, "Do you have any intention of continuing to teach, Professor?" "Heh," Atticus chuckled softly. He picked up a group photo from his desk and carefully wiped the dust from the frame. "I'm afraid I might disappoint you, Granger Potter. Being a professor at Hogwarts is a good job, and perhaps one day I will make that decision. But at least in the short term, I have no such plans." Professor Blaine's answer left Hermione feeling downcast. Even Harry, for a moment, forgot about the methods to deal with the Inferi. He stared at the young face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight and the purple eyes that seemed darker than when he first met him. Suddenly, he remembered the beginning of the semester, when the 3 of them had inquired about Professor Blaine from Hagrid. "Professor," Harry hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. "We heard something from Hagrid about your school days, the black witch you encountered in the Forbidden Forest when you were in 5th year. Did you ever find out who she was?" Atticus paused in his wiping, glancing at Harry with a smile that turned enigmatic. "That's a good question, Potter. To be honest, I've been pondering that for many years. I've always wanted to understand the purpose of the woman who broke into Hogwarts and killed me when I was a young wizard, but it wasn't until a few days ago that I began to piece it together." "Who is she?" Harry and Hermione's eyes widened as they exclaimed in unison. "I can't tell you right now," Atticus Blaine replied, lowering his gaze with a faint smile as he returned the photo frame to its original place. Noticing the disappointment etched on the young wizard's faces, he pursed his lips, thoughtful. "Why?" Then, with a gentle smile, he added, "As a consolation, you can ask me other questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Of course, Potter, if you're thinking of asking me how to pass the practical class, there's no need. Consider it done." Harry, caught off guard by Professor Blaine's insight, grinned sheepishly. He clicked his tongue in mild regret, his eyes inadvertently drifting to the group photo that Professor Blaine had just set down. Suddenly, his curiosity piqued. He raised his eyebrows and met Professor Blaine's gaze. From the moment he first entered this office, Harry had been intrigued by the transformation in Professor Blaine's eyes since their school days. Now, with the rare opportunity to have his questions answered, he was eager to seize it. Atticus, sensing Harry's curiosity, chuckled softly. "All right, if you're truly curious, would you tell us?" Harry asked, his voice tinged with shyness. "There's really nothing I can't share." "Potter," Atticus replied, leaning back in his chair with a gentle smile. "Actually, it all ties back to an event on Christmas Eve during my 5th year." Hermione set her quill down neatly and sat up straight, her posture as attentive as if she were in class. "That night, 2 things unsettled me. The first was the Black Witch who suddenly invaded Hogwarts, and the second was Headmaster Dumbledore." Atticus gestured for Harry to hold back his defense of Dumbledore. He looked up at the cold stone ceiling, his eyes distant with memory. "That night, Headmaster Dumbledore used a simple, disarming spell, yet it revealed to me what a truly powerful wizard looks like at the pinnacle of the contemporary magical world." For some time after that night, I pondered a question. If, in the future, I were to face a wizard as formidable as Headmaster Dumbledore, how could I ensure my survival and even triumph in such a confrontation? Harry and Hermione exchanged uneasy glances. After a moment, Harry whispered, "That's just a misunderstanding, Professor. Under normal circumstances, Headmaster Dumbledore would never harm you." "Headmaster Dumbledore is the greatest white wizard of our time," Hermione added, her voice faltering under Professor Blaine's intense gaze. "In my opinion, losing to such a wizard isn't something to be ashamed of." "I don't see it the same way, Miss Granger," Atticus replied calmly, rubbing his fingers together. "The first step to surpassing someone is to firmly believe in your heart that you can do it. So, I've never considered a wizard like Headmaster Dumbledore or the Dark Lord to be absolutely invincible." End of this chapter. Chapter 71. The Enigma of Magic. Harry and Hermione exchanged bewildered glances. Defeat Headmaster Dumbledore? Even in his wildest dreams, Harry had never entertained such a notion. It seemed utterly impossible. Harry was certain that if Professor Blaine's words were to spread, they would be met with widespread ridicule. Yet Atticus Blaine appeared unfazed by the audacity of his claim. He spoke calmly. "To defeat someone, you must first understand the gap between you and them. So, what do you think is the gap between me and Headmaster Dumbledore?" "A person as knowledgeable as Headmaster Dumbledore must know many powerful spells that ordinary people have never heard of," Hermione analyzed thoughtfully. "Just like the ancient magic you taught us in class, I believe Headmaster Dumbledore's mastery of ancient magic is beyond ordinary imagination." "A powerful spell," Atticus smiled, acknowledging her point. "This is indeed a critical factor. Headmaster Dumbledore's magical talent is unquestionable. He is also a diligent wizard. Even though he is over 100 years old, he continues to learn and improve himself. Under normal circumstances, I cannot possess more magical knowledge than Headmaster Dumbledore. That much is certain." Ron would surely regret missing this conversation, Harry thought, holding his breath in anticipation. He reminded himself to focus. Not everyone had the privilege of engaging in such a high-level discussion. "However, this is not the main reason I couldn't defeat Headmaster Dumbledore, Miss Granger," Atticus continued. "In terms of enhancing spells, I have an unparalleled intuition. I realize that with persistent research, the power and versatility of spells would not prevent me from overcoming even the most formidable wizards in a short time." If the discussion were about becoming a knowledgeable scholar, Hermione would have plenty of insights to offer. But discussing how to become a powerful wizard was something she had never considered. She frowned, looking at Professor Blaine, waiting for him to reveal the answer. "Actually, it's not that complicated," Atticus explained with a smile. "The key lies in the magical power within each of us wizards." "Magic?" Harry asked, puzzled. "Yes," Atticus nodded. "Every wizard experiences a magical outburst in their youth. This is the proof of our innate talent, and it's the only time in our lives when our magical power increases dramatically." After that, magic enters a long, steady growth phase as we age, remaining with us throughout life. At the moment of our death, our magical power reserve is at its peak. You mean to say that your biggest disadvantage compared to Headmaster Dumbledore is the vast gap in magical power due to the insurmountable age difference? Hermione deduced accurately, while Harry was still trying to grasp the concept. Indeed, Miss Granger, Atticus replied, pleased to converse with someone so perceptive. The enormous gap in magical power renders all skills and methods trivial. If I don't address this disadvantage, then unless Headmaster Dumbledore becomes too frail to wield his wand, victory is unattainable. Standing before him for even 5 minutes would be an impossible luxury. On the night the Dark Witch appeared, Dumbledore was shaken when a simple disarming charm nearly nullified the most powerful protective spell Atticus knew. Since then, he had been contemplating how to compensate for his disadvantage in this area, knowing that, in the world of wizards, the higher the level of a duel, the less effective spells become. The true battle between the most powerful wizards is a clash of their magical energies. However, overcoming this challenge is not straightforward. The growth of magical power follows its own natural laws, and any attempt to artificially enhance it can lead to dire consequences. Atticus Blaine had witnessed many dark wizards in the underground world who resorted to grafting the blood of magical creatures to boost their powers. This practice not only tainted their spirits, but also caused often irreversible, mutations in their bodies. Atticus grappled with this dilemma for a long time, eventually devising a cunning solution. Since a wizard's magical power cannot be increased overnight, he created a secondary storage space for magic, in addition to the usual reservoir. Drawing on alchemical principles, Atticus dedicated considerable time to developing a new form of magic. He transformed his eyes into vessels for storing magic, gathering the energy dispersed throughout his body and channeling it into his eyes. This effectively gave him an external magical organ. In the heat of a duel, the magic stored in his eyes acted like a charger, supplying him with a continuous flow of power. As two young wizards gazed in awe at his eyes, Atticus smiled gently. The reason my eyes have changed color so dramatically is due to prolonged exposure to high concentrations of magic. Whenever necessary, the magic in my eyes flows back into my body. If you ever notice my eyes returning to their normal color, it means a situation has arisen that demands my utmost effort. Incredible, Hermione exclaimed with admiration. This method is unheard of, Professor Blaine. I bet no wizard has thought of this in thousands of years. You truly are a genius. Perhaps, Atticus replied with a modest expression, it's merely an act of desperation. He didn't consider himself particularly great. In truth, his inspiration came from his identity as a time traveler and the ninjutsu known as 100 Ho no Jutsu. This technique involves sealing the body's chakra in a specific way, releasing it when needed to achieve a level of combat far beyond the norm for a short period. This magic gave Atticus the confidence to face Dumbledore and return to Hogwarts. If an unexpected confrontation with Dumbledore arose, this magic would allow Atticus to hold his ground long enough to escape. However, this ingenious magic had its drawbacks. If Atticus exhausted his stored magic in a duel, he would need to consume large quantities of magic recovery potions to replenish the energy in his eyes quickly. Relying solely on his own magic would take him a year or more to regain peak condition. Unfortunately, magic recovery potions are costly. Atticus dedicated the rewards from his daily tasks to the orphanage where he grew up and set aside funds for rare books and research manuscripts. A significant portion of his earnings went toward purchasing potion ingredients. As a result, despite earning a substantial amount over the past 3 years, Atticus lived a frugal life. As the second-year plot draws to a close, I am still developing the next storyline, which will diverge from the original book for a time. Although the last book faced challenges, I am committed to crafting a compelling narrative. After deviating from the original storyline, it becomes quite monotonous for the narrative to constantly adhere to the same plot. Additionally, I would greatly appreciate your support. This book has yet to surpass a certain number of collections, which is admittedly a bit challenging. End of this chapter. Chapter 72, Sharing Secrets. Sharing secrets is the most direct way to get closer to each other. After listening to Professor Blaine reveal his secrets, Harry felt a bit embarrassed once he calmed down. He glanced hesitantly at Hermione, who also seemed to hesitate at his unspoken question. "Do you have something to share with me?" Atticus Blaine asked, rising from his seat. He walked over to the fireplace, picked up the boiling kettle from the shelf, and poured himself a cup of tea. By the time he returned to his seat, it was clear that Hermione and Harry had reached some sort of agreement. "Professor Blaine, do you think hearing voices that others can't hear is a good talent?" Harry asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Atticus, sensing that his efforts to build a rapport with them were finally bearing fruit, hid his expression in the steam of his tea and replied gently, "It depends on the situation, Potter. I can't make an accurate judgment based on a simple sentence." A suffocating silence fell over the room. Hermione remained silent, while Harry looked visibly troubled. Professor Blaine was a professor Harry admired greatly, but he knew that Blaine's primary purpose at Hogwarts was to investigate the Chamber of Secrets incident, not just to teach. Harry hoped to assist him, provided it didn't implicate himself, Dobby, or Hagrid. Ideally, Professor Blaine would discover the secret chamber, or the monster within, and the matter would be resolved without further consequences. "Here's the thing," Harry began cautiously, choosing his words with care. "When I first entered your office, you asked why we went to the 3rd floor after attending Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day party last Halloween. The truth is, I heard a strange voice. It first appeared in Professor Lockhart's office." Over the next 10 minutes, Harry detailed the strange voice's occurrences. After hearing everything, Atticus leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "What do you think the sound was made of?" he asked. "Are you sure you were the only one who heard it, Mr. Potter?" "That's true, Professor Blaine," Hermione interjected cautiously. "Harry, Ron, and I were together at the time, but neither Ron nor I noticed anything unusual." Atticus nodded, understandingly. He carefully recalled the journey from the basement to the 3rd floor. Under the eager gaze of the 2 young wizards, he spoke slowly. "If I'm not mistaken, it should be a snake that made that sound." "A snake!" Harry exclaimed, while Hermione looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Professor Blaine's simple guess pierced through the fog that had clouded her mind for so long. "Yes, it must be, Harry." Hermione stood up abruptly, her face flushed with excitement, her fingertips trembling. "Everything makes sense now. Only you can hear that sound because you're a parcel tongue. No one else can understand the hissing of a snake." "But," Harry countered, following Hermione's line of thought, "at that time there were only ghosts in the basement and passageway besides us. If there really was a snake, it couldn't have hidden itself in the wall, right, Hermione?" "Maybe," Hermione replied, frowning at Harry's words. She hesitated before continuing. "If the snake is small enough, it might be able to slip through the cracks in the bricks, or perhaps it has a special ability to move freely within the walls. After all, normal snakes can't petrify people, Harry." Hermione's guess certainly had merit. It was a possibility, but just that, a possibility. As long as something has existed, no matter how careful you are, it will inevitably leave traces, Atticus Blaine remarked with a smile as he stood up. He seemed to be in high spirits, finally having something to occupy his time. With a wave of his wand, he gathered all the scattered letters on the table. Turning to Harry and Hermione, he said, "Let's revisit the scene. Perhaps we can uncover some intriguing clues." The night was dark, and on this Sunday evening, few young wizards roamed the castle. Most were in their common rooms, either doing homework or playing games like wizard chess and gobstones with friends. As they passed the 2nd floor, they encountered Filch, who was angrily threatening 2 first-year students to clean up the muddy water on the floor or face being chained and hung in his office. Atticus, ever kind, intervened to help the young wizards. "You don't have to be so harsh on them, Filch," he said gently. Filch, though unconvinced, dared not defy a professor's order. "Soon, Professor Sprout's mandrakes will mature, and your Mrs. Norris will be back to health." The trio made their way to a passage leading to the basement near the foyer. It was pitch black, devoid of any light. At the seam between the wall and the floor, remnants of black candle wax from Nick's Death Day party were still visible. "I was standing right here," Harry recalled vividly, even after more than 4 months. He quickly led Hermione and Professor Blaine to the middle of the corridor, pointing to the wall. The voice came from within the wall, then moved up to the ceiling, eventually leading us to the 3rd floor. Atticus lit his wand and examined the wall's surface, following Harry's guidance. After a moment, he nodded and said, "It seems we need to open this wall to see what's inside." "Open the wall?" Hermione exclaimed in disbelief. "Of course, Miss Granger. Otherwise, how would we discover how the snake was moving inside the wall?" Atticus replied in a relaxed tone. He raised his wand and made a few casual gestures in the air. With a few flashes of light, the solid wall was effortlessly cut open, revealing what lay behind. It was a pipe. Behind the rock wall, moldy pipes emitted a foul stench. If one listened closely, the sound of running water could be heard. "I always thought the wall was solid," Harry muttered, astonished. "Now the problem is clear." Hermione's face turned pale. "I can't imagine how large a snake must be to hide in such a big pipe." "There are still many questions to answer, Miss Granger," Atticus said, narrowing his eyes. He leaped onto the broken wall and carefully examined the thick pipe. After a moment, he placed his wand in the palm of his hand and commanded, "Show me the way." End of this chapter. Chapter 73, Violation. The magic wand in Atticus Blaine's palm began to spin rapidly, resembling a windmill, and it showed no signs of stopping. "What does this mean, Professor Blaine?" Hermione asked nervously, her eyes fixed on Atticus, hoping for an explanation. "This means," Atticus replied calmly, ceasing his efforts as he grasped the wand firmly. He directed his gaze toward a small section of exposed water pipe. "Salazar Slytherin cast numerous powerful spells on his Chamber of Secrets, including ones to prevent its location from being discovered. This has thwarted my plan to find the chamber directly through magic. To be honest, this is quite troublesome. Hogwarts Castle has stood for thousands of years, and no one knows how many times the sewer pipes have been renovated. The original design drawings of the castle may have been lost by now." Atticus's words left Harry and Hermione visibly disappointed. This was the closest they had come to uncovering the mystery of the Chamber of Secrets since the incidents began. In the dim light, Harry frowned, staring at the water pipe. Ever since Professor Blaine had suggested that the sound he had been hearing was made by a snake, Harry felt a nagging sense of incongruity, as if he had forgotten something important. "What should we do now, Professor?" Hermione asked worriedly, not noticing Harry's strange silence. "Should we tell Headmaster Dumbledore about this discovery?" "Not for now, Miss Granger," Atticus replied, dismissing the idea without hesitation. He was determined to be the first to discover the secret room, or at least ahead of Dumbledore. Mythical creatures were at stake, and he had his own plans. Atticus jumped down from the wall, restoring it to its original shape with a wave of his wand. The pipes in the walls are connected to the entire castle's sewage system. Unless there's no other way, I prefer not to search through them one by one under the bubble head charm. In the coming days, I plan to spend more time in the library. First, to identify the species of snake in the chamber, and second, to see if I can find the original architectural drawings of Hogwarts Castle. Although it's unlikely the chamber's location will be marked, there might be clues to its approximate location. "Is there anything I can do to help, Professor Blaine?" Hermione asked eagerly. "Of course, Miss Granger," Atticus replied with a smile as they descended to the 1st floor. "I've heard from other professors that finding key information in a sea of text is your forte. You can assist with the 2 tasks I mentioned, but try not to let it interfere with your usual study time. If I haven't found the answer by next Saturday, you can join me in the library to help." Meanwhile, Ron had spent nearly 2 full days bedridden in the dormitory after the Defense Against the Dark Arts practice class on Friday. He no longer dared to insist that dealing with 3 giant spiders was a stroke of luck. "I'm beginning to agree with Malfoy's assessment of Professor Blaine, Harry," Ron said weakly, staring at the curtains of his 4-poster bed as Harry returned to the dormitory deep in thought. "Who carries something like that around and shows it to young wizards? It should be an Auror's job to handle such dark creatures." After Harry recounted the night's events, Ron, who had been in a half-dead state, suddenly perked up. His eyes gleamed with curiosity as he eagerly asked, "Did Professor Blaine tell you in detail how to conceal magic power in your eyes?" Ron's bluntness often left people feeling exasperated. Harry, visibly frustrated, exclaimed, "It's definitely not a simple spell, Ron. Even a genius like Professor Blaine took quite some time to master the magic he designed himself." Ron pursed his lips, glancing over at Seamus, Neville, and Dean, who were chatting and laughing together. His tone grew more serious. "Whether or not that old lunatic in Slytherin is hiding a snake in the Chamber of Secrets, Harry, I believe as long as Professor Blaine is at the school, his heirs won't dare to continue their activities. With Hufflepuff's Justin Finch-Fletchley back to normal, this should be over for good." "I don't disagree with Professor Blaine's theory, Ron," Harry murmured, frowning. "I just feel like there's something I've overlooked. And before the school board allows Professor Blaine to leave Hogwarts, he should find the Chamber of Secrets. Otherwise, if that monster causes trouble again, who are we supposed to rely on? Something feels off, Ron." As Harry lay on his bed, a sudden realization struck him. He leapt up, eyes wide, and dashed to his desk, ignoring Ron's bewildered stare. He rifled through his school bag, searching frantically. Just moments ago, Harry remembered something crucial. He had seen the monster in the Chamber of Secrets through the memory Tom Riddle had shown him. It was a massive, hairy creature with tangled black legs, numerous gleaming eyes, and pincers as sharp as knives. It certainly didn't resemble a snake. What had gone wrong? Opening his notebook, Harry's expression turned serious. Professor Blaine's theory seemed sound, explaining why no one else could hear the terrifying voice except him. Who would have thought the monster moved so stealthily through the pipes? Yet, the past Riddle revealed held an undeniable truth. After Hagrid was expelled from Hogwarts, the attacks ceased, and Riddle himself received a special contribution award from the school. "Harry, I think you should get rid of that book. I keep thinking this Tom Riddle is a bit of a villain," Ron said, frowning as he watched Harry spread the notebook on the table and pick up his quill. "Don't be silly, Ron. Riddle's memory has given us something valuable, hasn't it?" Harry replied without turning around. As soon as the ink touched the page, elegant handwriting appeared on the blank paper. "Hello, Harry Potter. I thought that after learning the truth about the Chamber of Secrets incident, you had forgotten me in some dusty corner of the bookshelf, destined for another 50 years of darkness. By the way, I think Rubeus Hagrid should remain at this school. Have you shared the truth from my memory with anyone else?" Harry blushed but didn't waste time on pleasantries with Riddle. Instead, he directly shared his discovery from that night. "Riddle, do you think you made a mistake? In my opinion, Professor Blaine's theory is more plausible. However, the creature you showed me in the memory clearly wasn't a snake, was it?" The notebook didn't respond immediately, as if Harry's words had thrown it into confusion. After 2 minutes, it finally displayed a question in messy handwriting. "Can you tell me more about this Professor Blaine?" End of this chapter. Chapter 74, Asymptotic Foing. At noon on Monday, Harry sat at the dining table with a gloomy expression. Before him lay heaps of treacle fruit pies, grilled eels, roast beef, and lamb chops. Malfoy's grotesque imitation had soured his mood even further. "Seriously, Harry," Ron, seated beside him, looked at him with concern. "I think you might be losing it with that notebook. Otherwise, how could you dare to take off your earmuffs while handling the mandrake?" Earlier that morning, during herbology class, Professor Sprout had tasked them with transferring some well-growing mandrakes into brighter pots. Distracted by Riddle's notebook the previous night, Harry had absent-mindedly removed his earmuffs. The consequences were immediate and severe. The screams of dozens of nearly mature mandrakes caused Harry to collapse headfirst into the field. Professor Sprout, startled by the unexpected scene, cried out and nearly fainted. "Suspicious indeed, Harry," Hermione remarked, glancing at Professor Blaine, who sat at the staff table with dark circles under his eyes. She then turned to Harry with a frown. "Why do you think a notebook that's been in the dark for 50 years is more credible than Professor Blaine's theory?" Harry couldn't deny that his poor state that morning was linked to the notebook. Yet, Riddle's theories seemed plausible. Riddle suggested that the sounds Harry heard in Professor Lockhart's office and near Mrs. Norris before the attack could be an ordinary snake hunting in the pipes. Riddle's memory insisted that the monster Hagrid kept, which he couldn't name, was responsible for a girl's death in the bathroom 50 years ago. Principal Dippet was wiser than Dumbledore, Harry. The Ministry of Magic was more objective back then. If they hadn't confirmed it, how could they have expelled a young wizard so easily? Ron and Hermione exchanged glances. While the results of the attacks 50 years ago seemed to support Riddle's claims, emotionally, they preferred to trust Professor Blaine's hypothesis. "Let's set this aside for now, Harry," Hermione said, frowning. "By the end of this week, I can go to the library with Professor Blaine to search for information. If I find a snake capable of killing and petrifying people, Harry, I think it's time for you to hand over your notes." "Are you guys discussing this afternoon's practical class?" Neville interjected, his chubby face full of worry. "Oh no, I forgot about that," Hermione exclaimed, glancing again at the top of the Great Hall, where Professor Blaine was deep in conversation with Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall. She slammed the table in frustration, causing Harry to gasp. Due to a significant drop in the number of young wizards voluntarily attending practical classes, Atticus Blaine spent the first half of Monday afternoon's Defense Against the Dark Arts class explaining to the first and second-year students how ancient wizards often set traps in magical ruins and the methods dark wizards typically used for poisoning. In the remaining time, he led the students to the 8th floor of the castle to confront a ghostly corpse in a classroom. "Do you think a freelancer who runs errands, finds potion ingredients, and delivers goods would know so much about dark wizards' habits?" Siamus whispered to Dean on their way to the 8th floor. "I have a cousin who used to be an Auror, but retired due to injury," Dean replied mysteriously. "He once told me there's a group of people who aren't Ministry of Magic employees, but who make a living." Atticus Blaine made a living by capturing dark wizards. Privately, people referred to him as a bounty hunter. Before this, he was a renowned wizard hunter, known for tracking down dark wizards. Dean's deduction gained the approval of many, even prompting Hermione to blink thoughtfully. There's no other reasonable explanation. Ron, who had already decided to withdraw from the practical class, said seriously to Harry, "I've heard from my father that the Ministry of Magic sometimes collaborates with unofficial specialists to combat dark wizards, smugglers, and other villains. They're a powerful group, but they dislike being bound by rules and choose not to join the Ministry of Magic." Although Atticus, who was leading the group, did not turn around, his powerful magic endowed him with heightened senses, allowing him to hear every whisper from the young wizards. Bounty hunter? Atticus smiled inwardly. He was not a bounty hunter who attacked dark wizards. Rather, he was a dark wizard who had been targeted by bounty hunters. "So," Atticus said, standing before the oak door, turning to face the young wizards with a serious expression. He read their names aloud. Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy, Hermione Granger, Daphne Greengrass, Neville Longbottom, Hannah Abbott, Ginny Weasley, Michael Corner, Blaise Zabini, Theodore Knott, Eloise Midgen, Terry Boot. The students whose names I've called will enter the labyrinth in pairs." Atticus glanced at the pale-faced Potter and Malfoy and smiled. "This labyrinth has a memory function. It has recorded your progress from the last challenge. I hope you can seize this final opportunity. By the way, if anyone can defeat the dark creatures within the labyrinth, I will award their house up to 50 points. Gulp. Harry swallowed hard, and for the first time, there was something other than fear in his eyes. Throughout a student's life, few opportunities arise to earn 50 points for their house. Many young wizards might not accumulate that many points from their first year to their 7th. Hermione became visibly anxious, realizing that without textbooks and materials, her adaptability was not as satisfactory as she had hoped. Harry and Draco reluctantly stood together once more. Harry's self-sacrificing spirit had calmed Draco for a few days last time, but the feeling didn't last. Draco seemed to interpret Harry's behavior as condescension, prompting him to mock Harry relentlessly. "This time will be different, Potter," Draco declared aggressively before entering the door. He pulled out a short silver knife from his pocket, typically used for handling potion ingredients in class. If you beg me, maybe I'll show mercy and save your life later." Harry had heard rumors of Draco's private consultation with Professor Blaine about the royal object curse. Judging by the situation, Draco seemed to have gained some proficiency with this powerful spell. "Are you sure you gave us a hint, Professor Blaine?" Begging Draco for protection was more unbearable for Harry than facing danger itself. He looked at Professor Blaine with a pleading expression, hoping for some reassurance, but unfortunately, Professor Blaine continued to smile silently, offering no guidance. Harry's eyebrows furrowed. When he first entered the maze, Professor Blaine had worn the same smile and had warned him that the maze was dark, advising caution to avoid falling. Wait, dark? Harry's eyes widened as if he had just realized something significant. End of this chapter. Chapter 75, The Thief. Just 5 minutes later, Harry burst out of the classroom, cheering with excitement. Malfoy, trailing behind with a sullen expression, emerged slowly. "I did it, Professor! I did it!" Harry exclaimed as he rushed towards Professor Atticus Blaine, who had been anticipating this moment. "I understood your hint, Professor. It was indeed simple. I just used a little magic spell to defeat them." "How did you do it, Harry?" Hermione was the first to recover from her stunned state. She hurried over to Harry, her fingers trembling with excitement. "Excellent, Potter." Atticus Blaine smiled with satisfaction. "The method is secondary. The most important thing is that you overcame your inner fear, which is a tremendous achievement. You are undoubtedly the winner, Potter. I will award Gryffindor 50 points. And," Atticus added, smiling at Draco, who seemed a bit overlooked, "whether the final defeat was completed is not the most important thing. In the face of dangerous dark creatures, you did not choose to flee, but summoned the courage to fight. This is also commendable. Malfoy, you have earned Slytherin 30 points." Both Harry and Draco accomplished what many others could not, and the young wizards applauded them with admiration. Ron shouted joyfully, tossing Harry's schoolbag into the air. The textbooks spilled onto the ground, but Harry grinned happily, showing no malice. Draco, surrounded by fellow Slytherin wizards, no longer appeared as upset. He quietly glanced at Professor Blaine, and when he noticed the professor smiling at him, Draco shyly pursed his lips and lowered his proud head. No one noticed that when Ginny saw the book flying out of Harry's schoolbag, her face turned pale, and her body became rigid. In the end, aside from Harry and his group, no one else figured out the trick to defeat the infernal corpse. However, compared to their first encounter with the infernal corpse, the mental state of the young wizards seemed much improved. After emerging from the maze for the first time, many of them appeared faint. Professor Blaine repaired Neville's robe with magic and stood in front of the oak door of the classroom, awarding 10 points to each young wizard who persevered until the end. At this moment, the magic contract had completely lost its effectiveness, and he could finally teach the group of young wizards how to deal with the infernal corpses. This is a very evil black magic creation that challenges our moral boundaries. When thousands of ghostly corpses form a massive army of death, they can indeed cause significant trouble. However, when their numbers are limited, they are quite easy to handle, Atticus explained, glancing at Harry, who already knew the answer. He asked with a smile, "How many of you noticed my hint before Mr. Potter entered the classroom for the first time?" "Dark beings mostly don't like light," Hermione said, her voice dull with realization. She patted her forehead in frustration, suddenly understanding. "It's flames, Professor. Like Devil's Snare, infernal courses prefer darkness and humidity. We only need a flame spell to deal with them." Thanks to the points Harry and his friends earned, the score gap between Gryffindor and Slytherin was not as wide as before. This made it possible for Gryffindor to win the House Cup again this year. During dinner, when Professor McGonagall approached to inquire about the second-year students' course selections, she walked up to Harry and gave him an encouraging smile. All the senior wizards knew what the infernal corpse was, and it was indeed a remarkable achievement for a second-year wizard to defeat it with his own wisdom and courage. That night, a grand celebratory banquet was held in the Gryffindor common room. Fred and George were pulled out, their contents scattered haphazardly across the room. Harry's heart sank as he surveyed the chaos. "Who could have done this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Neville. Atticus Blaine, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "It seems someone was searching for something specific," he said thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the mess with a keen interest. "But what could they have been looking for?" Harry shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. "I have no idea. Nothing seems to be missing, at least nothing obvious." Hermione, who had just arrived, took in the scene with a sharp intake of breath. "This is terrible, Harry. We need to report this to Professor McGonagall immediately." "Yes, but first, let's try to figure out what they were after," Harry replied, trying to maintain his composure. "Maybe there's a clue here somewhere." As they began to sift through the disarray, Ron joined them, his face a mask of concern. "Blimey, Harry, this is a right mess. Do you think it has anything to do with the infernal corpses?" Harry paused, considering Ron's question. "It's possible," he admitted, "but I can't think of why anyone would be interested in that." Atticus, who had been listening intently, nodded. "It's worth investigating. We should keep an eye out for anything unusual." The group continued their search, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that whoever had ransacked the room had left no obvious traces. Frustrated but determined, Harry resolved to be more vigilant in the coming days. As they finally began to tidy up, Hermione spoke up. "We should also be careful about who we trust. Until we know more, it's best to keep this between us." Harry agreed, feeling a renewed sense of caution. "You're right. We'll figure this out together." With that, they finished cleaning up the room, each of them silently vowing to uncover the mystery behind the intrusion. As they settled in for the night, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The drawers were pulled open, their contents scattered across the floor and the mattress. Harry's eyes widened in surprise as he stepped on a few pages from Walking with Trolls. As he and Neville worked to put the sheets back on the bed, Ron, Seamus, and Dean entered the room. Dean exclaimed, "What's going on, Harry?" "I don't know," Harry replied, frowning and shrugging his shoulders. Ron began to examine Harry's clothes closely, noticing that all the pockets had been turned inside out and the school bag was upended. "It looks like someone was searching for something," Ron said with a serious expression. "I don't think it's about money, Harry. Check to see what's missing." It didn't take long for Harry to realize that Riddle's diary was gone. When he told Hermione about it the next day, her expression mirrored Neville's from the previous night, one of deep concern. "But only Gryffindors could have taken it," Hermione said. "I mean, no one else knows the password." "That doesn't rule out the possibility that Malfoy finally figured out how to brew Polyjuice Potion from Snape. Have any of you lost hair recently?" Ron asked, puffing his cheeks in thought. "Compared to Malfoy," Harry said worriedly, "I think it's more likely that Dobby did it." End of this chapter. Chapter 76, Sudden Attack. On Friday evening, the large faculty lounge was nearly empty, with only Atticus Blaine and Professor Flitwick present. They stood in the center of the room, focusing intently on a chair. "I'm definitely not as skilled with this type of spell as Minerva," Professor Flitwick admitted with a high-pitched voice, looking somewhat embarrassed. "If you want to make things more realistic, Atticus, I suggest you seek Minerva's advice. You know, Professor Flitwick, Professor McGonagall has always disapproved of me using these spells to scare students. I doubt she'd be willing to help," Atticus replied, scratching his head in frustration. After a moment of contemplation, he waved his wand, carefully adjusting the flow of magic. He added 2 new channels of magical energy to the original creation. The chair began to transform. Its seat bent upwards, 2 of its 4 legs morphed into arms, and the remaining 2 became legs. Before long, a tall, muscular figure with a menacing face appeared in the lounge. Professor Flitwick watched the conjured figure with interest, refraining from commenting immediately. Atticus continued to manipulate his wand, and the figure underwent dramatic changes. The once straight back hunched over, and its smooth skin sprouted coarse, black hair resembling a wild boar's bristles. The face elongated into a cone shape, teeth became jagged and uneven, and the eyes took on a sinister gleam, exuding a bloodthirsty aura. "Very impressive, Atticus. If I hadn't known beforehand, I might have been fooled. Oh, there's one detail. After a werewolf transforms, its pupils shrink," Professor Flitwick noted. "Thank you," Atticus replied, adjusting the detail with a flick of his wand. He then directed the werewolf to move around the lounge, adopting defensive stances when threatened and offensive ones when hunting. "How did you handle this werewolf that seemed intent on attacking you, Atticus?" Professor Flitwick asked, climbing onto a table to get a better view. "I doubt you had a silver dagger on you at the time." "You guessed right, Professor Flitwick," Atticus said with a light smile, crossing his arms as he recalled the werewolf's movements. "It wasn't as complicated as it sounds. There were over a dozen werewolves after me. I used a combined spell, incorporating a magical fire similar to a metal spear transformed from stone, and drove it straight into their hearts. This prevented their bodies from regenerating. None of them lasted more than half a minute under the spell, and they all turned to ash. There are many spells effective against them, but some could have caused me trouble. I was quite young then, and the Ministry of Magic's strict prohibitions still held some sway over me." "Atticus," Professor Flitwick began, imagining the scene of Atticus vanquishing the werewolves. He shivered slightly, but before he could continue, the door to the staff dormitory burst open. A senior girl from Ravenclaw rushed in, her face pale with fear. It was Penelope Clearwater, the Ravenclaw prefect and Percy's girlfriend. Atticus quickly swung his wand, transforming the werewolf back into a chair before the door fully opened. He turned his attention to Penelope, whose expression was one of sheer terror. Atticus Blaine's beautiful brown curly hair was almost soaked in sweat as a sudden, unsettling thought crossed his mind. "Miss Clearwater, perhaps you should explain why you entered the staff room without knocking." Professor Flitwick, usually a very good-natured person, couldn't help but feel a bit embarrassed that someone from his own house had acted so disrespectfully in front of another professor. Professor Flitwick and Professor Blaine. Tears shimmered in Penelope's eyes, and she seemed genuinely frightened. "Another student has had an accident. It's the Chamber of Secrets." Professor Flitwick gasped, nearly falling off his chair. Atticus narrowed his eyes and asked in a deep voice, "Please clarify, Miss Clearwater. What is your source of information? Who was attacked, and what is the current condition of the student?" Penelope's body trembled as she wept softly. Atticus comforted her gently for a long time before she calmed down enough to speak. "We were in Transfiguration class when Filch suddenly burst in to inform Professor McGonagall that another student had been attacked. We rushed out, and Filch led us to the scene where Mrs. Norris was attacked. There was an ominous message on the wall: her bones will remain in the Chamber of Secrets forever." At this, Penelope broke down in tears again. Professor Flitwick approached, standing on tiptoe to gently pat her back, encouraging her to continue. Professor McGonagall conducted an urgent investigation and discovered that Percy's sister, Ginny Weasley, a first-year Gryffindor student, had disappeared. Ginny Weasley? That little girl who had seemed unwell and listless recently? Atticus's eyes grew serious. "Why her?" "Atticus!" Professor Flitwick exclaimed. Atticus nodded, understanding the urgency. He instructed Penelope not to wander the castle alone and to stay with the professors as much as possible. Then, without looking back, he rushed out of the faculty dormitory. As he emerged, he realized that most of the students were already aware of the situation. Panic and unease were etched on their faces, as if a catastrophe was imminent. Atticus strode purposefully to the third floor of the castle, where Filch was herding curious students back to their respective common rooms. In the inner circle, Professor Snape was attempting to erase the ominous message. Upon seeing Atticus approach, Snape said in a low voice, "Dumbledore has already inspected the area and found nothing. Additionally, someone used a powerful freezing spell to disable all your surveillance telescopes. He's unsure if your monitoring can still capture any valuable images." Atticus nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "I'll check it out later. Those telescopes automatically send recorded images back to my office as memories. I haven't sensed any intrusion into my office, so I believe those images should still be intact." The sky outside had turned completely dark, and Atticus stared into the night. He felt as though the castle was under siege, yet there was also a sense of relief that something he had long anticipated was finally unfolding. The heir to the Chamber of Secrets was active once more, and this time they hadn't just petrified a student, but had kidnapped Ginny Weasley, Bill and Charlie's sister. In his heart, Atticus had already feared the worst for the girl. It only takes one spell to end a life, and in a few hours, Ginny Weasley's body might be cold. A surge of inexplicable anger rose within Atticus. In addition to being the investigator of the case, he felt a personal responsibility to ensure the safety of the students. Atticus Blaine, a member of the school board and a professor of defense against the dark arts, found himself nearly attacked by the heir of Slytherin right before his eyes. This incident left him feeling somewhat affronted. "Where is Dumbledore now?" Atticus asked, shifting his gaze back to Professor Snape. He noticed that Snape's eyes mirrored the same unease that was evident in the young wizards around them. "Lucius Malfoy, representing the school board, has invited the Ministry of Magic to intervene," Snape replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "They've been surprisingly efficient this time. I had a discussion with Cornelius Fudge in his office earlier, and I heard they're planning to take Hagrid away." "Hasn't Hagrid been proven innocent?" Atticus frowned, perplexed. "Why are they still detaining him?" "Only Dumbledore, and we believe in his innocence," Snape said, his lips pressed into a thin line, his expression dark. "Cornelius Fudge is weak under pressure. He needs to do something to withstand public scrutiny." Atticus's eyes flickered with thought, and after a moment of contemplation, he spoke slowly. "I should find out what Dumbledore is doing now. Today, I was curious and asked the editor about the data, which is around 1,400. To be honest, although the collection hasn't reached 1,000 yet, I'm quite pleased with this number of follow-ups. I want to express my gratitude to all of you who have supported this book, regardless of whether the data is good or bad. I will continue writing, but good results certainly boost my motivation. Additionally, the editor informed me that, barring any unforeseen circumstances, the book should be available next week. I don't know the exact day, but it will be during the 4th round of recommendations. I'm uncertain if this is favorable or not. The timing feels a bit rushed. I had anticipated it would be after 4 rounds. I was hopeful about making it onto lists like Sanjiang, but that's beyond my control now. I'll be taking a day off on Saturday to think about the upcoming plot and to build up some reserves. I don't have the face to add 4,000 words on the first day. End of this chapter. Chapter 77. I apologize, everyone. I need a few days to gather my thoughts and make some adjustments, so I kindly ask for your understanding and patience during this brief hiatus. Additionally, I have confirmed with the editor regarding the release schedule. The book will officially be available on the shelves next Friday. Thank you for your support and understanding. End of this chapter. In the Gryffindor common room, Percy sat silently on the sofa, his face buried in his hands. Across from him, Fred and George sat with their friend Lee Jordan, who was trying to offer some comfort. Ron, looking ashen, lingered by the fireplace, his lips moving in a constant murmur as if he had just endured a severe illness. Beside him, Harry anxiously shook his legs, frequently glancing at the common room door, clearly waiting for something. "I found it!" Hermione's voice broke the tense silence as the portrait of the fat lady swung open. She emerged, breathless, waving a note triumphantly. Harry quickly rose from his chair to meet her, while Ron remained unresponsive. "Professor Blaine's guess was correct," Hermione announced, her eyes gleaming with determination. She thrust the note into Harry's hand and began to recite its contents in a hushed tone. "In our country, there are many terrible beasts and monsters roaming about. Among them, the strangest and most lethal is the basilisk, also known as the king of snakes. This kind of snake can grow to an enormous size and live for several centuries. It is hatched from a rooster's egg by a toad. The basilisk kills in a remarkable way. Besides its deadly fangs, its stare can also kill. Anyone who meets its gaze will die instantly. Spiders flee from the basilisk, as it is their mortal enemy, and the basilisk will flee from the crow of a rooster, as it is deadly to it. But," Ron finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain, "so far, no one has died. If the basilisk's gaze could kill, what about Colin and Justin?" "That's because no one has looked directly into the basilisk's eyes," Harry replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as if his stomach were filled with ice. "Hagrid's rooster was strangled. Colin saw it through his camera, and the basilisk's gaze burned the film, so Colin was only petrified. Justin saw it through nearly headless Nick, who saw the basilisk but can't die again, right? And Mrs. Norris, Hermione added seriously. I suspect she saw the basilisk's reflection in the water from Myrtle's bathroom. Harry, you were right. Riddle lied to you. The monster in the Chamber of Secrets is a basilisk, not some furry creature. Hagrid might be innocent. Hermione's conclusion left Harry pale and speechless, struggling to comprehend how Riddle's memory could have misled him. Let's go find Hagrid, Harry declared after a moment, regaining his composure. Hagrid must know something. I don't know why Riddle showed us a false memory, but he might be the real culprit. Regardless, Hagrid has to have some crucial information. Professor McGonagall had instructed all the students to remain in the common room, but Percy was unable to enforce her order. Unaware of the events unfolding outside, Harry dashed to the dormitory to retrieve his invisibility cloak, leaving Hermione and Ron momentarily speechless. As they sneaked out of the common room, they found the castle eerily silent, devoid of wandering students. Only the patrolling professors moved through the corridors, their expressions grim and foreboding. The question of Ginny's fate loomed heavily over them. Why had the heir of Slytherin targeted her? Even Hermione had no answer. A chilling image haunted Harry's mind, finding Ginny transformed into a lifeless body, with Mrs. Weasley collapsed on the ground, weeping. Harry's heart was heavy with regret, as if a poisonous snake were coiling around it. He stood by Ginny's lifeless body, while Mr. Weasley knelt beside her, pulling out his hair in anguish. Harry wished he had given Riddle's diary to Professor Blaine sooner. Professor Blaine, with his keen insight, had deduced from mere sounds that the attacks were caused by a snake slithering through pipes. Harry was certain that if Professor Blaine had communicated with Riddle's diary, he would have uncovered the secrets hidden within Riddle's mind. Under a starry night sky, they hurried towards the illuminated window of Hagrid's hut. Silence enveloped them until they reached Hagrid's door. Harry, after a cautious glance around, removed his invisibility cloak. Moments after they knocked, Hagrid flung the door open, brandishing a crossbow, with Fang the Hound barking loudly behind him. Hagrid was visibly startled by their presence. In his agitation, he spilled water from the kettle, nearly extinguishing the fire, and knocked over the teapot with a clumsy swipe of his large hand. "You've heard about Ginny, haven't you?" Ron asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Hermione remained silent, leaving Harry to break the uneasy tension. "Yes, I've heard," Hagrid replied, his voice choked with emotion. He seemed unaware that they had come to question him, his eyes darting nervously towards the window. Just as he was about to cut a thick slice of fruitcake, a loud knock echoed from the door. Harry swallowed his questions, pulling Ron, who was in a daze, and Hermione into a corner to hide. Hagrid, grabbing his crossbow once more, opened the door abruptly. "Good evening, Hagrid," said Dumbledore, entering with a grave expression, followed by a peculiar-looking man. The stranger was short and stocky, with disheveled gray hair similar to Professor Blaine's. His round face was etched with anxiety, and his attire was eccentric, a pinstriped suit, a bright red tie, a black cape, purple-pointed boots, and a dark green top hat tucked under his arm. "That's my dad's boss," Ron whispered to Harry and Hermione, finally snapping out of his stupor. "Cornelius Fudge, Minister of Magic." Hermione nudged Ron sharply to silence him. For Hagrid, the worst had come to pass. He sat on the bed, his face pale as he tried to defend himself. "I can't help it, Hagrid," Fudge said briskly. "It's a dire situation. Dumbledore has urged me to remain calm, but the pressure to close the Daily Prophet after those two young wizards were petrified was immense. Now, with this incident, many in the Ministry are aware that Weasley's daughter may have met with misfortune. I hope you understand, Cornelius, that I trust Hagrid completely," Dumbledore said solemnly, though his blue eyes reflected a sense of helplessness. Even Dumbledore had to navigate the constraints of authority within a stable society, unless he wished to upend everything. Fudge, however, seemed resolute. He fiddled with his top hat, avoiding Dumbledore's gaze, and said nonchalantly, "From my perspective, Dumbledore, a little precaution is necessary. If we eventually discover that someone else opened the Chamber of Secrets, Hagrid will be released, and the Ministry will issue a full apology." End of this chapter. Chapter 79, Expulsion. Fudge's explanation failed to convince either Dumbledore or Hagrid. I can go with you to the Ministry of Magic, and you can have the Aurors examine me, Minister, Hagrid pleaded, his lips trembling. But please, don't send me to Azkaban. Before Fudge could respond, there was another knock at the door. Dumbledore moved to open it, and Harry received a sharp elbow to the ribs, letting out an audible gasp. Lucius Malfoy, who had just whispered something to Draco, strode into Hagrid's cabin. He was wrapped in a long black traveling cloak, a cold, satisfied smile playing on his lips. It seems you've already discussed the key issues, Lucius nodded with satisfaction. Very good. Very good. What are you doing here? Hagrid roared angrily. Get out of my house. You're not welcome here. Dear friend, believe me, I take no pleasure in entering your abode, Lucius sneered, glancing around the small cabin. You call this a house? Forgive me, but the elves in my household live in more decent quarters than this. Lucius turned his attention to Dumbledore. I just forgot to communicate with you, Dumbledore. Someone informed me you were here. What is your business with me, Lucius? Dumbledore maintained his composure, though Harry was certain he saw two flames of anger flickering in Dumbledore's eyes. Hagrid's hut hadn't been this lively in a long time, and Lucius had yet to reveal his intentions. At that moment, Atticus Blaine entered through the open door. It seems I've come at a bad time, he remarked, detecting an unpleasant odor in the air as soon as he stepped inside. The occupants of the cabin reacted differently to Atticus's presence. Dumbledore exchanged a glance with him, but neither spoke much. Fudge, who barely knew Atticus, greeted him with a cold demeanor, not even bothering to nod in acknowledgement. Lucius, upon seeing Atticus, slightly tempered the pride on his face. He was aware of where Cacus Foley had found this man, and the people from there were known to be reckless dark wizards. Unlike Dumbledore, a gentleman through and through, Lucius preferred not to provoke such individuals if he could avoid it. As it happens, I intended to visit you after delivering some bad news to Dumbledore. Atticus Blaine, Lucius addressed Atticus, who appeared somewhat surprised. Lucius then produced a piece of parchment from his cloak, fixing his cold gray eyes on Dumbledore as a smirk curled his lips. Things are dire, Dumbledore. Lucius waved the parchment dismissively in front of Dumbledore. It's time for the board of directors to let you go. This is a temporary suspension order. You'll find all 12 directors have signed it. We feel you haven't demonstrated your talents. How many attacks have occurred so far? At this rate, Hogwarts will be devoid of young wizards by summer vacation. Fudge, evidently unaware of this development, was taken aback by the school board's decision. However, as Lucius pointed out, the appointment of the headmaster was the board's responsibility, beyond his interference. Hagrid rose abruptly from the edge of the bed, his shaggy, dark head brushing the ceiling. How many people have you threatened and blackmailed to get them to agree, Malfoy? He growled. Atticus let out a slight, cold snort. Cacus Foley had warned him about this, but he hadn't expected Lucius to act so swiftly. However, Dumbledore interjected, his voice slow and clear, ensuring everyone heard each word. Neither Hagrid nor Fudge can prevent this from happening. I must comply with the school board's orders. Atticus Blaine stood quietly, absorbing the weight of Dumbledore's words. I've only truly left this school when everyone here has betrayed me, Dumbledore said, his voice resonating with a profound sense of wisdom. And you'll find that at Hogwarts, those who seek help always receive it. As Dumbledore finished speaking, he cast a peculiar glance toward a shadowy corner of the room. Atticus, who had been subtly observing the scene, followed Dumbledore's gaze with a thoughtful expression. A genuine smile spread across his face, as if he had discovered a hidden truth. He then shifted his attention and noticed Lucius Malfoy watching him intently. We will all miss you, Dumbledore, Lucius said with a sly grin. He retrieved another piece of parchment from his pocket, similar to the one he had produced earlier. Now that Dumbledore's matters are settled, Atticus Blaine, I regret to inform you that the school board has also entrusted me with your dismissal order. I always believed that sending an unknown investigator into Hogwarts was futile. It seems my judgment was correct, Atticus Blaine. I suggest you pack your belongings now so you won't miss the earliest train tomorrow. Atticus responded with a calm smile, unfazed by the news. How do you say that? Of course, as an investigator appointed by the school board, it's within your rights to dismiss me. However, I have no intention of leaving Hogwarts just yet. Lucius narrowed his eyes, and even Fudge turned his attention to Atticus for the first time. This is the order of the school board, Blaine. Are you going to defy it? I'm afraid you're overlooking something, Mr. Malfoy, Atticus replied with a cheerful demeanor. While I may no longer be a special investigator, I am still the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor appointed by Headmaster Dumbledore himself. The authority to expel a professor lies solely with the headmaster. Since Hogwarts currently lacks a headmaster, I must remain until the next one arrives. Lucius glared at Atticus, momentarily at a loss for words. He had indeed overlooked this crucial detail. Very well, Lucius finally conceded, nodding curtly. When the next headmaster arrives, I will have a thorough discussion about the faculty appointments at this school. With that, Lucius turned on his heel and left without another word. Dumbledore, observing Atticus's determination to stay, smiled warmly. I trust you have a plan for what comes next, he asked gently, before departing. Indeed I do, Atticus replied with a confident smile. I have no intention of standing idly by. Explain to me, Professor Blaine, Hagrid said hesitantly, his face troubled as he stood under Fudge's watchful eye. You know the situation, Professor Blaine. Perhaps you can help clear up this misunderstanding. As the room emptied, leaving Atticus alone in the once crowded cabin, he prepared to return to his office to review the surveillance records he had set up. But before doing so, he glanced toward the corner of the cabin and cleared his throat. The matters here are concluded. How long do you three plan to remain hidden? End of this chapter. Chapter 80, Riddle and Voldemort. Yaya lay behind the closed door, desperately scratching at it with her front paws. Her whimpers were filled with sadness, as if she understood that her owner had gone away, and it was uncertain if he would return. Professor Blaine, Harry gasped, lifting off the invisibility cloak. He was panting heavily, struggling to find the words he wanted to say. Professor, is the Ministry of Magic really going to imprison Hagrid in Azkaban? But Hagrid is innocent. What evidence do they have to prove that Hagrid is the heir of Slytherin? Hermione looked at Professor Blaine, who was eyeing the invisibility cloak in Harry's hand, and cried out, The world of adults is sometimes very complicated, Miss Granger, and dealing with people is also a very complex matter. Atticus Blaine walked over to a stool and sat down, rubbing his temples wearily. That's why, after I graduated, I chose to live alone, cutting off contact with former classmates, opting for a simpler life. Atticus could see the panic in the hearts of the three young students. Perhaps even Harry himself didn't realize how lost they looked after Dumbledore was expelled from Hogwarts by Lucius Malfoy. For more than half a century, Hogwarts and Dumbledore had become almost synonymous. Without its headmaster, the school felt like a mountain collapsing. However, for Atticus, this was a significant opportunity. Then you three probably owe me an explanation. His calm tone made Harry, Hermione, and Ron, who felt as if they had lost a loved one, suddenly feel the air was less suffocating. They exchanged glances, and finally, Harry took a deep breath and recounted the entire story about the mysterious diary at a rapid pace. When we found out about Ginny's accident, Hermione immediately went to the library. Based on your hints and the information we had, we discovered that the monster in the Chamber of Secrets was likely a basilisk. We went to Hagrid to confirm the truth about the events from 50 years ago. Tom Riddle's diary can take you back to the past and show you recorded memories as if you were experiencing them firsthand, correct? Atticus closed his eyes, deep in thought. He had already revisited his lost memories, recalling the detailed memory of the diadem Horcrux he destroyed in his 5th year. He quickly deduced that the diary was a new Horcrux. Unbelievably foolish, Atticus murmured to himself. Splitting one's soul multiple times as an anchor to keep a decaying body in the world was a foolish act. Atticus had experienced the cycle of life and death, and he was perhaps the only one who had died and lived again. To him, life and death were like a dream, and he found it difficult to understand Voldemort's obsession with immortality. However, there were still aspects of the diary that had been in Harry's possession that Atticus found astonishing. He had seen and destroyed Horcruxes before, but this diary, which had been with Harry for only a short time, had the ability to actively deceive and mislead through words. Atticus was surprised by its high level of activity. "I think there's something you might not know." Atticus opened his eyes, looking at the three anxious students, and said calmly, "Tom Riddle is the name Voldemort used when he attended this school. Or rather, it is his true name. Voldemort's original name." The words Atticus Blaine whispered struck the trio like a thunderbolt. Ron's legs gave way, causing him to knock over the kettle on the stove. Hermione let out a scream, while Harry's face turned ashen. "So it's true," Harry exclaimed, too overwhelmed to question how Professor Blaine had obtained this information. He fought against the nausea and dizziness that always accompanied his encounters with Voldemort's dark magic. It's always been him. He opened the Chamber of Secrets 50 years ago. He framed Hagrid. Apart from Harry, Professor Blaine was the only wizard Ron had ever seen who could utter the name Voldemort with such calmness. Normally, this would have astonished Ron, but now his heart was filled with nothing but despair. Before learning this news, he had clung to the hope that if they found the Chamber of Secrets in time, Ginny might still be saved. But now, even the ever-optimistic Ron couldn't dare to imagine his sister's safety. "Professor Blaine." Hermione's forehead was dotted with sweat, a sign that her brilliant mind was working at full speed. "If we explain all this to the Ministry, could Hagrid and Headmaster Dumbledore— If the notebook were still in your possession, perhaps the Ministry of Magic might listen to us, Miss Granger," Atticus replied, understanding Hermione's intent, but delivering a disappointing answer. "But as it stands, we have no evidence to prove the diary ever existed. Given its incredible properties, the Ministry will not easily believe the claims of 3 underage wizards." Professor Blaine's statement filled Harry with guilt. Ron had warned him about the diary's danger, and Hermione had advised him to hand it over. Yet, he had stubbornly kept it by his side, a decision that nearly led to disaster for Ron's sister. Atticus fell silent, lost in thought. From Harry's account, he deduced that the diary was merely a vessel for Voldemort's thoughts, lacking any inherent ability to act. Given the circumstances, it seemed likely that Ginny Weasley was the student involved. But how had she come into possession of Voldemort's Horcrux? Could she have stumbled upon it hidden within the castle, much like he had in the past? Another pressing question was whether Ginny Weasley was still alive. In Atticus's estimation, the likelihood of Voldemort's Horcrux directly killing Ginny was low, as such an action would be too wasteful. He understood Horcruxes well. They served 2 primary functions. First, to anchor the creator's soul to the world in the event of a fatal injury, preventing their death. Second, to resurrect the creator by consuming the life force of anyone who came into contact with the Horcrux. Atticus knew that absorbing vitality was not an instantaneous process. Based on his observations of Ginny Weasley over the past few days, her life force had not yet reached a critical point. This suggested that the Horcrux would not easily consume her vitality within a few hours. However, if they delayed until the next sunrise, Ginny's fate would be uncertain. P.S. Please remember to cast your votes. End of this chapter.